Sorry. Thank you for my
Morning, ladies, gentlemen, junior, our young people present, those online and physically here present. I hope the online audience can hear us well.
Loud and clear.
Yes. Thank you, yes, Professor Sewankambwe. So it's Professor Net Nachimuli, Dean School of Medicine. I'll be chairing this defense. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to this defense. And before really I say much more, I can assure you our candidate is here present, ready, smiling, and ready to have this PhD. So we wish you very well, Dr. EKWARO Anthony OBUKU. So we have our examiners present, and I would like to introduce them before we begin quickly. I apologize, we've started a bit late, but we were actually already conducting the defense business. We start with a meeting, and in that meeting is where we agree on whether the candidate can proceed or not. And so far it is all good that we have accepted that this defense. So at least that tick has been made. The next one is this very activity. And at the end of the session, we shall tell you whether he has become Dr. OBUKU PhD or not. So our panelists, we have the opponent, Dr. Akech Samuel Owor. He's online. I'll briefly say something about him. He's a consultant pediatrician, principal clinical research scientist at Kemri Center for Geographic Medicine Research Coast, which is called Kemri Wellcome Research Program. So he's based in Kenya. And he's also an intermediate research fellow at the same place. A lecturer in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, University of Nairobi, and is a visiting research fellow, University of Oxford, United Kingdom. You're very welcome, Dr. Samuel Akech. Please confirm if you can hear us.
Thank you, Prof. Nachimule. I can hear you clearly. Thanks for the introduction.
You're welcome. The other panelists, we have Dr. Susan Kiwanuka. She's here with us. She's senior lecturer in the Health Policy Planning and Management, School of Public Health, College of Health Sciences, Makerere University. And as far as I also know, she's the head of that department. You're welcome, Dr. Susan.
Thank you very much.
We also have Dr. Patrick Biakagaba, senior lecturer, Department of Environmental Management, School of Forestry, College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences. Here in Makerere, we call KAES. And he's part of this panel. You're welcome, Dr. Patrick Biakagaba. The course of the defense, we may be joined by the external examiner, Professor Edwin Barasa, who is the director of the Kemri Wellcome Trust Nairobi program, the head of the Health Economics Research Unit. If he's already on, Professor, you're welcome. Along this journey, Dr. Buku has worked with some people, and notably among them his supervisors. And I'm happy to say that he's been supervised by one of our great mentors, Professor Nelson Sewankambo, who is online. You're welcome, Professor Sewankambo.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm sorry for not being there. I have a terrible flu. I came in and I thought I'm a public health nuisance. So I'm in my office participating online or attending online.
You're very welcome, Professor Sewankambo. The other supervisor is Professor John Lavis from McMaster University, Canada. Professor, are you online? He's not online, but we know he will join in due course. So members, that is the panel and the supervisory team. I think in the interest of time, I'll really just would like to briefly introduce our candidate, Dr. EKWARO Anthony Obuku. You can stand up for recognition. Tell us about his work, whose title is Production and Use of Postgraduate Students Research, a multiple method study of universities in Uganda and other low and middle income countries. This title is very heavy, and we are today going to know really what it means, what he did, what are these low and middle income universities. Was Makerere one of them? But not to preempt what he has to say, we are going to have him present for as long as he wants, but he has to be aware that a day has 24 hours, and we have also other activities planned. But he's likely to present for about 30 minutes. And then thereafter, we shall tell you what will follow. So very welcome. Let's put our phones on silence. And those online, please mute. When time comes for you to speak, we shall allow you. But for now, all eyes should be on Dr. EKWARO Obuku. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, please proceed.
Yes, thank you so much for joining me in this defense and online to really understand what postgraduate students research does in terms of changing society. I'd like to dedicate this work to my parents, of course. My father was here around about 2000, 2003 doing an MPH. And I used to go get him for the money from him just across there. And his thesis was never published, presented it all over the place. And in fact, this child here is about 20 years old, having bought it from Madrid in one of his presentations. A family, strong family is the foundation of society. I'd like to really recognize my family, which is here with us today, and including my children. And it's my hope that at least one of them will become a scientist. This is why I told them that, we need to, inspire something which is quite difficult. I acknowledge a big number of people, my supervisors, the blockbuster, Professor Sewan Campbell, you all know him, doctoral committee, comrade from the Africa Center, and then, of course, the Ghana Medical Association, the broad data collection team. You can see it's very difficult to say that PhD is only your work. And then, of course, the JCRC team, where I started the Fogarty Fellowship. And then at the universities where I collected the data, the funder, and McMaster, where we did the winter classes with my classmate Boniface here. I declare this work as original, and any reproduced work is under the copyright of open access. This work was approved for ethics and other regulatory issues by the Office of the President and the National Council. So I'll finish the most important part of the PhD to show you that really it is work of many people and the support of the family. But because I have to, sit at the exam, I'll tell you about the rest of the story. Now, what is knowledge translation? I'll assume we all understand what knowledge is. So there are 4 models here. Model A, people like the College of Health Sciences produce research and push it to those who use research. They can be parliament, they can even be in the community. That is model A, called the push efforts. If you're very lucky, the Ministry of Health can invite you and present your research. They pull the research to you. That is model B. In model C, you have a stable arrangement where the agricultural research organization in Uganda, NARO, produces drought-resistant varieties for Karamoja, for instance, cassava, and through a partnership with the Agricultural Advisory Services, NADS, takes this technology to the farmers there and solves the problem. This one is called exchange efforts, model C. In model D is the ideal, and very few institutions in the world or systems have this, like National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, where even patients are part of the discussion around which drug is the most important to enter the guidelines of that country. So what is knowledge translation? It is moving research from where it is produced at Mackay University and ensuring that it helps the people who need that information change their lives post-treatment. It is an iterative process, meaning back and forth. Okay? And as I said, it's a process, not an event. So it's not enough to publish. It has to be ethical, and it has to impact society. There are synonyms: implementation, science, operational research, and so on. And there are several models. This is just one model of Levis, that's one kind of others, but there are several models. But what is key is that the context is different. And therefore, we examine the unique context of postgraduate researchers in Uganda and elsewhere. So why did we do this work? Universities claim that their core business is to produce knowledge. And like any other business, you've got to invest time, you've got to invest resources, money, and in our case, patients or participants of the research. And the aim is to create knowledge, ultimately to impact society. Makerere is celebrating 100 years. And if you look down there, they are saying leveraging 100 years of excellence in building a transformed society. So that is the purpose really of the university. But how well can we tell that actually the university does its job? So they have proposed evaluation approaches. Thank you very much, IT. So one approach proposed by scholars is to conduct what's called performance-based funding. How much research you produce, how much is published, how much is cited. But scholars have argued that they are diminishing returns. And in economics, that means the cost begins to outweigh the benefits. And also intellectual dishonesty has been observed where there is publication inflation so that it can be promoted, and neglect of the teaching function while focusing on research. However, in Iran, some clever people in the Tehran University of Medical Sciences came up with something called SATORI, self-assessment tool for research institutions to look at how well research institutions transfer knowledge from production to use. And it uses a consensus approach to identify weaknesses and strengths. And of course, this is what we modified for our setting. So what is the gap? Several evaluations in Uganda, several evaluations globally, none had attended to the unique enclave of postgraduate students. And a postgraduate student is, in this case, a person who has finished a first degree and coming back to medical school to do a second degree, surgery, medicine, pediatrics, public health, clinical epidemiology, and so on and so forth. And we also wanted to know whether previous research has actually looked at how this research supports decisions, policies, or systems. So what is the problem? This picture tells it all. Those are 1,000 theses in the rubbish bin. And I got this one from Facebook, a page called Voice of My Soul. I also checked yesterday, it was still there. And they are saying, after all the struggle to write projects, see where it ends up, a country without value for intellectual property. So this is actually the problem we are trying to understand and explore more. What does it mean? You have invested money, but it is a waste of resources if it's not published or accessible. It is an injustice to the participants, researchers, including systematic reviewers who need that information, and those who use policy. Many have argued that knowledge is power, and in this thesis, we are counter-arguing that it is not as powerful if it cannot be accessed, if it's not disseminated through publications and other avenues. So how did we approach this one? Now, this is the summary of a very busy slide, but I want you to pay attention to the blues. The left blue is to tell you that we did 4 studies. And the next blue there is that it came up with 5 papers. And just to encourage you that this was a PhD, we used some theoretical models and frameworks and tools, to make it complicated. And therefore, we have the Prisma for the systematic review. When it came to paper 2, we are investigating that, what improves the chance of them publishing, these students, causality. And we use the probability model, central limit theorem, and also the generalized linear model. Don't worry, mommy, this one I'll explain to you later. Now, in the paper 3, we use the model for research utilization and knowledge transfer. These have been published before. And then in paper 4, or sub-study 4, we use the knowledge action cycle by Graham and Logan, and then 2 other models, including the Satori, which I introduced to you earlier. So what was the question of research? Does students' research support health decisions, policies, and systems in Uganda and other low and middle-income countries which are similar to Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, but also in Asia and and South America. Unlikely in the UK, we didn't include those ones. And we had 2 assumptions that when students do research, they want it to be used. And many students write that in their significance. It will impact policy. And we assume that decision makers will actually accept it and take it up. And this question was informed by the knowledge action cycle of Graham and others. Just imagine that's how complicated these things can be, but it's very simple. You can look at that diamond or inverted pyramid or funnel, and that represents knowledge creation from primary studies called knowledge inquiry. Synthesis means making a meaning out of so many papers, and then presenting tools, and around it is the knowledge action cycle. We shall talk more about that shortly. So the overall objective, again, very repetitive, is to examine the production and use of research from postgraduate students in these settings. So pay attention to this. This is the conceptual framework. This is part of the PhD-ness of this whole business. So of course, you can see the There's knowledge production on the left and knowledge application on the right. You've got to imagine a lot, those two columns. And the questions of research we asked is, how is the research question identified and developed by the postgraduate student? How do they get their topics? And then below there, what are the support mechanisms to help them identify questions which will help Uganda and the rest of the world? And the knowledge application is, what happens to this student's research? Okay, does it get published? Does it gather dust? We shall see. What are the support mechanisms for now making sure this research can be used by the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, and so on and so forth? The other research question we asked is, what are the interventions and determinants of knowledge production and application? What can help them move research from question identification proposal up to use? And these sub-studies 1 and 2, 1 to 3, and 1 and 2 answer these various places. And we shall, keep repeating this, and I'm sure you'll understand it a bit better. The other aspect was, how does the research support the health system? And this was by sub-study 2 and 3. Remember, I showed you 4 studies. And, the process of how you identify the health system gap, propose a solution, conduct the research, disseminate the research, and also update the gap, probably solve the problem. And the interplay is around priorities. And finally, examining those support mechanisms in sub-study 4. Where was this research done? Predominantly Uganda, in public universities and private universities. There were 2 public universities, Makerere and Mbarara, and they are ranked, highly ranked in Uganda and Africa, and 2 private universities, Mukono, or the Christian University, and then Nkozi, the Matters University. And of course, for sub-study 1 was, what is happening in the rest of the world? So it's called a systematic review. And we are to limit it to countries which are similar to Uganda, which have, according to the World Bank, an income of $13,000 per year. Can you imagine earning that money? That's where we are going as a middle income country. But, it's quite a big variation. We collected data. You can see I was there. Examiners, please. I was there collecting my data. And those are the files. My comrade Apunyo, my 2 students there, and one probably even finished the PhD before me, Deborah Nangendo there, and then Tempa, the sports science people. Then we went also online. Alison is here. In case people are shaky, Alison, please tell them that we collected data from the DRGT, DSpace, Google, PubMed, and so on and so forth. So really, again, telling you that we used multiple approaches to collect data. So what did we find? In the first study, first of all, we published 2 papers. And the first study wanted to know what are the interventions that can increase publication and then use, but we measured use using citation. Okay, we also wanted to map the determinants, what is associated with these 2 things. So paper 1 in 2017, the protocol, which is the Bible. How are we going to conduct the systematic review using what we call PRISMA? PRISMA, you remember those theoretical approaches? PRISMA is one of them. Preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Like, let's do this. And then we had the report. So what did the report say? Before that, I wanted to show you where in the conceptual framework this study is anchored. And on the extreme right, of course, around knowledge application. Okay, we wanted to look at what happens to the student's thesis research using a systematic review, and then of course what are the interventions or determinants or predictors. So this don't worry about this busy slide, just shows you how we went about the process. Bear in mind, just on the left side, the blue, identification of the papers, a screening, and then looking at which one is important, eligibility, and then the final one we included. And out of 5,000 articles, I'm now on the right, we remained with 14 in the systematic review and 12 in the meta-analysis. What was the main result? That globally, in low and middle income countries, okay, using a conservative approach, it is 7% which is published. That is called fixed effects model of meta-analysis. And the confidence interval for the true value lies between 7 and 8%. Using a liberal approach, so let's adjust and make it favorable, it is 23%. So you could easily say for every 5 theses, 1 is published. How many are used? We couldn't find the information. Doesn't mean it's not used, but we couldn't find the effectiveness studies. which documented use in a way that we could prove that it was used. And studies on intervention and determinants of productivity in Uganda and other similar countries were also noted. So this is the same information. It's called a forest plot, meaning you are now in a forest, theoretically speaking. Okay, you're not supposed to understand it, but I made it easier for you. Especially my mother is there, she needs to understand. So, mommy, this is called a forest plot. And when you see those lines there, that is the number of studies, each study. The plus in the middle is what they have estimated. How many have they published? And on the left, those are now the extremes. 6%, as low as 6% in Turkey. That is the biggest study of 22,000 sample size. And then 41%, the extreme on the right, that was a study from Togo. And then, of course, the one we are interested in is the diamond. The diamond there, this is now the summary of all of these 12 studies we included, and it's at 23%. So it's the same information, but presented statistically to look a bit more complicated, but actually they are words which can describe. So the take-home message from sub-study 1 is that the suboptimal publication would like to have more publications, and use was hardly documented. And then interventions or determinants were not documented in a way that we could understand the effectiveness. Then we said, okay, if this is what is happening globally, what is happening in Makerere, the Harvard of Africa celebrating 100 years? So we did the same, looking at a period of 15 years and said, let's look at all the theses. And we found that the student sample, most of them were done public health. And of course, my father's thesis, they also checked, it wasn't published. The average age was 32, and at least half of them had been funded. What did they study? They studied predominantly infectious diseases, HIV, malaria, TB. And what about the health system? They looked at service delivery pillar, majority of them. And what really was associated with publication? Interestingly, if you enrolled for your master's program when you are younger, your opportunity to publish was better. And that is called, that is the association there, the negative regression coefficient. The other one was just, I think, an article. And so in sub-study 2, the summary result is, again, at Makerere, out of the 1,000, about 200 theses, 18% were published, okay? And how long did it take to start publishing on average? 2.3 years, which is about two years and 4 months. And, the interquartile and so on. But the other important point is in blue, that over time, the time to start publishing reduced. That is what is important. From about 2.5 years, 2.8, and on average to 2 years. To be used, we measured use through citation because that's what we could prove. Time to be used was about 4 years or 3.8 years. And then it came down to 2.7, that is median time to first citation. But it was about the same was used, suggesting probably one has to publish in order for the research to be accessed. How much of it was used in policy, which is our interest? Very few. At that time, we found only 4%, okay? We found 7, which constituted 4%. So what is the take-home message? Although postgraduate research was of priority, they researched all these important priorities, MDGs and so on, most was not published, up to 80%, and very few used. So up to 96% was not used, okay? And the publication was associated with age, okay, younger age, and when there was improvement, general improvement in publishing, and also, accessing these theses in the e-repository of Makerere University. Initially, it took about 10 years for your thesis to reach online. It went down up to about 3 years. I haven't shown the data. So we said, okay, these 7 here, can we see what really happened? So we did a qualitative study now, sub-study 3, and we discovered they are not 7, they're actually 16. So we looked deeper, and that is the advantage of complementing our methods, quantitative and qualitative. So what is important is, of course, the paper was published, but I want you to pay attention to the red. Those which are used in policy-related documents were only 16 theses we could find, 16 out of the 1,200. And then, of course, they were cited 22 times, okay, because one study can be cited multiply in different policy-related documents. And which part of the conceptual framework are we handling? We are handling this part of knowledge application, specifically the green part. Does it support decision making? So this table here shows the characteristics of the research and then the citations. Remember here, as you can see in red, there were 22 citations. So the 22 citations are here. We're now studying them deeper. This is qualitative methodology, go deeper. And in one characteristic was how was research used, type of research used? Predominantly instrumental to solve a problem. What is instrumental use of research? When you get research and apply it directly to solve a problem at hand. It's also called a problem-solving model, according to Carol Weiss framework. Symbolic use is, sort of political use, okay? You make a decision, then you get research to back your decision. And we have seen it in the political arena, even in Uganda here. So after the fact application, we never found an instance of conceptual use. Conceptual use would be, incremental exposure of ideas and rarely pinpoint citable research. When I interact with these professors, I also become a bit clever, that kind of thing, okay? But in the UK, it was serious. Decision makers were, the House of Lords, were interacting with professors in bars, and that's where ideas were born to strengthen the social sector policy in the UK, okay? So that is what we call diffusion of knowledge through conceptual use of research. You can't say, I used this study, but when you go to parliament, you start shining, you interacted with, Professor Zawangambo, and you got the ideas. So what types of citing documents were there? Predominantly guidelines of public health nature and clinical nature. Now we are the second black there. And then working papers for advocacy, predominantly. Which organization cited this research? WHO, so you can imagine, you're a student, if any students online, please publish your work because it can go to WHO level and actually impact policy. Or a network of community of practice, such as the South African Association of HIV Physicians. What were the priority areas? Child health, predominant pediatrics and child health, then malaria, HIV, and TB, the common big hits here. In terms of study design, cross-sectional, we had 75% of them as cross-sectional, and then RCTs, and then very few case control. So how was the research applied? I picked out, out of the 16 pieces, I picked out 4. The first one is by the current Minister of Health, by the way. Dr. Cheng, when she was a student, she did a very powerful study, which was used instrumentally to answer the question of how do you compare Artemether at that time to quinine, okay? And it was captured in the citing document on the extreme right, the WHO pocketbook of hospital care for children. Imagine this research as a student. It was a randomized control trial. Then Professor Chan also did work, which we shall talk about later in another example. And then pay attention to down there, Pimbaza Arthur also did work, which was used instrumentally, midazolam, bucomidazolam, the one you put under your tongue to solve the problem of, having convulsions, prolonged convulsions, compared to, at that time, compared to the azepam. Hey, the PhD had become tight. Now, and my mother is going to introduce me to the azepam in the clinic. I'll tell you the story later. So it was captured in the WHO list of essential medicines, this work by Pimbaza. Now, the one I want you to pay attention to, because in case studies, you highlight the extreme case, right? And here the extreme case is the symbolic use to justify a decision. And when you look at the British HIV/AIDS Association, they had already decided that they are going to use afotericin B. Then they looked for work and they found Dr. Kambugu's work. I had to mention it is my boss now at IDEA, so I had to bring it up. And they managed to say, in defense of afotericin B, we have found previous studies which have demonstrated manageable and reversible renal impairment. So that is symbolic use. I hope you appreciate the difference. Why I decided to bring about Professor Chan's work is to show that as a student, you can actually do a study which can change the dimensions. So if you look at this study, Chan's work was done in 2007, about 10 years before the first study, which was done by Baroness in 1998. So imagine it's the second study after 10 years. Now, the important thing is that this study is a so-called negative study results, negative. It is not one you would like to publish because, the p-value are not significant, okay? But she went ahead to publish it. And I want you to pay attention to the broad lines, Those are the confidence intervals. When you have very few patients, very little information, the lines are broad. Okay. Now, the first study by Baroness, the lines were broad. The arrow is there, and they are broad. The second study by Achan, the lines are also broad. But combined together, this is what they call the small study effects in meta-analysis. You can see the diamond. The diamond is the meta-analysis. You can see the width of the diamond is narrower, meaning the study contributed to what we call the optical information size to make a decision. And this is really the value of doing research of such nature, even at PG level. So qualitatively, what themes emerge? Synergistic relationships. You would find that institutions which are public in nature, like the US National Institute of Health or the CDC, working together with private institutions, the Infectious Disease Society of America, or the American Academy of Pediatrics, applying research to arrive at a new consensus. So stakeholder engagement, very key, and research is used actually as a consensus. People agree that this is the direction to take. And here, Dr. Iriso's study of 2002, thesis of 2002, which was looking at using sputum induction to detect TB in children, it was one of the 600 studies that was cited in this document. So also research is used in clusters. It's very difficult to have, what we call a panacea or that blockbuster study, which, all of a sudden changes the world. There were two pathways in the globalization of evidence. The first pathway was research done in Mulago here, goes to that high level of WHO and then applied globally, but also used locally. A very good paper was by the etiology of diarrhea in Mulago by Musime's thesis of 2004, Musime Victor, Professor Musime Victor. That was captured in the IMCI guidelines at that time, Integrated Management of Childhood Illnesses of WHO, and then later exposed to Ugandans, and then Dr. Sabrina Kitaka's study looking at pneumonia in children in Mulago here, particularly the PCP type, okay? That was also captured in the HIV pocketbook of WHO. The second pathway was a research that is done here and applied outside Uganda, and it's not, that guideline is not exposed to Uganda. And that was by Njama. She did a study on asymptomatic parasitemia. That means you have malaria in the blood, but you don't have symptoms. And it was applied in the Canadian Immigrations and Refugees Guideline. So I suppose when they are screening refugees, many people are migrating to Canada. When they screen you, this paper was saying you need to screen also for malaria. There was also the aspect of trade-offs of evidence, that even side effects are important in informing the decision. And the Pimbaza study was one of the 5 biggest studies with 330 participants that was used to caution on the harms of midazolam. And as I said, Professor Chan's study had negative results, but was very, very important in strengthening the evidence base. So what is the summary? Research was used to frame the problem, choose treatment or diagnostic options, or even defend the earlier choices in order to address priority health problems internationally. So after all this was done, we said, okay, so Makerere University students can actually produce research. And then it can actually be used in WHO, gives you some sense of pride. So, but what are the support mechanisms to enable them achieve this objective? So paper 5, which we already published, looks at the support mechanisms. And you can see, don't really pay attention to the detail, support mechanisms are all over the place. They are like a hydra, okay? It has 7 heads. So we used a tool called the self-assessment tool for research institutions, which earlier I talked about, developed in Tehran, University of Medical Sciences, and we modified it. That's why we call it M-Satori. The bulk of these students, 82%, had started developing their proposals. 43% had actually submitted theses, and about a quarter of them were from Barra University, 15% from Kono University, and then about 10% from Kozi University, and many of them were doctors, clinicians, and then of course, many of them have sponsored themselves. So pay attention to the red, hey, the thing moved. Okay, should I move it back? Pay attention to the red, to this one here. You alter your presentation so many times. It also alters you. Okay, that is what I meant to say. I didn't put it clearly. Hey, are we okay? IT? So pay attention to the red, oval shape. That is the score, the average score. So if the situation, you can look down there, range levels 1 to 5. If the situation was quite unfavorable and there was dire need for intervention, you scored 1. And this is the students themselves who scored. If the situation was good and needed no intervention, they scored 5. So the average was obviously 3, isn't it? Anything above 3 is good, anything below 3 needs improvement. So proposal development is done very well in these universities. They scored above 3. When it came to knowledge transfer, they scored below 3 at 2.75, promoting use even lower, and the list was priority setting. To what extent do we engage decision makers when we are choosing research topics, or do we recycle questions? So the take-home message was, while postgraduate students were strongly supported by their supervisors to develop research proposals, there were hardly any efforts to directly engage research users in the value chain of developing this research and using it. Commercial break. So what is the story? What does this mean? Is where we are going to next. It's 30 minutes. Can I proceed a bit? Thank you. To first, yeah. The thing with this PhD is a lot of talking, policy. So I learned how to talk. I used to deal with the numbers. When the professors convinced me to do it, talking increased. Now, summary of results. Sub-study 1, there was low publication, and those are the ranges. No effectiveness study on interventions, use, or determinants. The time to publication 2 to 3 years. And we also discovered some of the studies I didn't show you, some of the things I didn't show you was that students were not always first authors. And this was an interesting finding. In sub-study 2, again, Mackay University, low publication, 1 in 5, low use, and most of the use was in scholarly work. Scholarly work meaning informing future research. The determinants were age, research design, and important to note that there was a general improvement in time to publication across the board over the 3 periods. Research was used in the problem-solving model, predominantly instrumental or symbolically to support decisions already taken. And rarely, in fact, we did not find a conceptual use because of our approach. The themes were globalization of evidence, trade-offs in evidence, negative results were also useful. And then proposal development was strong, but priority setting and promoting evidence use needed improvement. What do other studies say out there? So we did a quick and clean, what we call scoping review, and this is our forthcoming paper, comparing publication by income status. I know there has been work going on by Jaffe and others, which show that if you invest in chemistry and physics, your future is brighter. Yeah. We also estimated and said, supposing we tag $1,000 to every research paper, every thesis, and we deducted those which had been published, we found 967 are the ones which were not published. Actually, I met someone who is now a professor yesterday. I said, by the way, I did not see your paper. She said, oh no, I didn't publish it. At that time, I had not caught the fever. But now she's a professor, she's all over the place. You get what I mean? So how do we get the students to get fever, to publish and get it out there? And I estimated it conservatively at about $1 million. But that is over a 20-year period. So what does it mean when you multiply the 10% interest rate? There's value there, there's a gold mine in those theses which needs to come out. In the blue is what we found in our study. Since the last time we searched with my colleague Alison in 2016, when we did the search, there have been at least 1, 2, 3, 6 studies, predominantly from Asia. Again, if you pay attention to the right, 31 to 55% range, not very far from the 41 up there, 41%, 6 to 41%. In the low and middle income countries, the country is similar to Uganda. What is the situation in high income countries? It goes up to 74%, generally higher. Message being, the economy may determine what happens, but also we need to invest. And it's very wonderful to see the macros coming up, money from government, and of course, the studies around finding solutions for COVID. How can I remove this, Eddie? So the other important thing was, although publication was necessary, it was not sufficient for application. There was a high correlation between publication and citation, 0.8% using Spearman's ranks correlation coefficient. And then not all publications were cited, and not all citations were from peer-reviewed publications. Some of the use was directly from theses because probably they were available online, in the repository of Makerere. But this is not new. You can imagine all the money the World Bank invests in doing feasibility studies, formative evaluations. Up to 31% of their reports are not even clicked. And those of you who are clinicians, the Cochrane was also suffering from the same. And therefore, the movement of giving evidence its feet began to take shape. That it's not enough to have a paper, you've got to go to the Ministry of Health, knock on their doors, discuss and negotiate. That is where we were 20 years ago with WHO. A study by Oxman and then my supervisor Levis and others discovered that for 50 years, WHO was using experts until they teased them, and now no WHO policy is passed without systematic reviews and rigorous evaluation by experts. So what is the research out there about barriers and facilitators for use? One of them is perceived irrelevance of research. Some people don't think research is relevant. Some lack the skills. The decision maker lack the skills to read, and researchers will use jargon. The other one is power and budget struggles. Who's going to lose when a decision is made? And what are the facilitators? Interacting with the decision makers and developing trusted relationships, timeliness and relevance of the research. And one of them said mass media. The other discussion point was publications aimed at scholarly audience are seen as irrelevant and less usable for decision making. As you saw, most citations, 17% were scholarly work. Although they were relevant according to MDGs, we discovered there were perennial health challenges which were neglected. For example, health finance. This is a complaint in Uganda, but this is not a topic that is favorable in the School of Public Health. It was less than 1% publication over 20 years. Supply chain. Okay, should we have pharmacies which are private in nature to solve the problem? This question hasn't been answered. Human resource, strikes all over the place. Students who can offer solutions by studying this, nowhere to be seen, guidelines. And there is a possible preference for peer-reviewed work compared to policy briefs. Recently, I was interacting with colleagues and, how many publications do you have? I said 70, I think. I said, what are they peer-reviewed? I said, okay, they are 30. But in my heart, I know the other than peer-reviewed were the ones which have caused impact. Health sector barometers, newspaper articles, and policy briefs have caused change more than peer-reviewed publications. Very important, students who are not necessarily first authors of their work. Authorship is an incentive and gives you that feeling of achieved. But we have also seen students publishing less than faculty in Johns Hopkins, and could power imbalances explain discouragement of students to publish. There's a systematic review on co-author problems, and this could be an issue around how we see and encourage students to publish. Finally, although our systematic review did not find data on interventions or determinants in low and middle-income countries, mentorship is key. In one systematic review by Wood and colleagues showed that if you mentored students, you would increase publication by about 3 times. And there are studies in low and middle-income countries to show that more students were more productive if their supervisors supported them practically through seminars, workshops, and co-supervision. But also in a study done here at the College of Health Sciences, Professor Nakanjako, who is now the principal, showed that mentors also need support. It's not obvious. There are gender angles there that I found. I don't want to dwell on them. Female supervisors, students of female supervisors published more, and things like that. But also we observe among the predictors was younger age, and maybe you think, do they have social priorities and more time at a younger age? But marriage did not correlate very well, for instance, with publication. And perhaps students that studied cohorts, because cohorts showed a better publication proportion, probably had access to mentors, and that's why they did it.
I came across this graduate research supervision and mentorship project at Bara University. And when I read down there, they made an argument and said, it is assumed upon graduation, one will adequately supervise graduate students. However, this has not happened. More often than not, graduate students never complete their studies in time, while others are abandoned. And there is no course actually to teach the mentors. What are the implications? What does this mean, this whole research? And what are the recommendations? One, universities and other colleges, at the College of Health Science, Mackay University, should do a similar assessment, introspect, self-assessment, and understand what is going on in terms of publications. Are we being cited? How is our research applicable to society? The second one is universities should incentivize publishing of master thesis. I did a quick, check at the Mumsa canteen there. Say, hey, are you going to publish your work? Me, I'm just getting a master's as I go. This publication, that kind of thing. They want to, they don't see the value, and yet there are some which have been very impactful, as you can see. So we owe a debt to society, and also publication will increase visibility and rankings of the university. The question is, should publication of thesis be a requirement for graduation? And therefore target funding. You can introduce something called S-Mark RIF for students to target their publications. Beyond publications, universities should invest in uptake of PG students' research, and these include what has been discovered in studies, but also when it comes to priorities. If I were the one, every student will start with a systematic review to understand what's out there before you come up with a fantastic topic. And then disproportionately, you could see RCTs, randomized control trials, being used so much. And there was hardly any diagnostic accuracy study, to test new diagnostic tools. And there was hardly any cost effectiveness study. Yet, cost is what limits our choices. Finally, how is the industry, Uganda Manufacturers Association, involved in priority setting? Who sets our research priorities? Are they the donors who give us the funds? Or do we go out there and take opportunities of these people who changed their production lanes to start making masks? It is until COVID came about that they started helping us. How much discovery research comes from students at Mark and similar interventions? Finally, is to inform you that this work is coming up in something called Evidence to Action Conference, for which we are part of this PhD. I met Professor Sewankambo and Professor Levis in 2012 when I was a faculty scholar at Moju doing a course on knowledge translation. And I was a hardcore guy. I wanted to do cancer research. And they told me, why don't you try this? And when I did political sciences, started talking a lot, and we discovered that talking a lot is very important in making decisions. And this conference here, Evidence to Action. Evidence to Action is a conference coming up by our group and our network, and of course, acknowledging ICE, the Campbell Collaboration and the Africa Evidence Network, to really try to apply these things. As part of my PhD, we had an offshoot called the Africa Center of Systematic Reviews. And now we are a world-renowned center, a network of people going all over the place and teaching people how to use evidence. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope, I'm within time by about 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
I hope you keep it to the end. And it's my pleasure now to invite Dr. who's online. Dr. Kate, this is the moment for you to interact with Dr. EKWARO OBUKU here and make us understand his work even better. Thank you, and I will leave you to take it on from there.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations, Dr. OBUKU, for giving a very good presentation. I think you kept everyone very much engaged. A PhD project, as you appreciate, is one of the biggest, actually it's the biggest intellectual work that you'll ever do. So coming to this point when you're doing public defense is really a big step. Congratulations for that. So for now, I'll just like to take you through some questions. And the first one I would like to start with is the problem or the concerns about reproducibility and replicability of research, which has been recognized as a big problem in science, in that a lot of research that has been done cannot actually be reproduced or replicated. And with that, people can argue that it's therefore not surprising that there's very low use of postgraduate research in policy and decision making, and that this is a general case in science, and that policy and decision makers tend to view research cautiously just because every research that comes out, it's difficult to reproduce and replicate. What's your take on that?
Yes, I wanted to absorb it. Thank you so much, Dr. Cage, for first of all accepting to examine me, and of course the panel of examiners. I'm very grateful for finding this time. Yes, it's a big problem. Research done in one context may not be reproduced in another for various reasons. And my take is that that's not the only problem. Most of the work which is being implemented today in the area of development economics, youth empowerment, youth employment, distribution of nets. In many instances, the effect size, the coherence D is minimal, less than 2. And some of the research being propagated by all these big bodies actually is not effective in the long run. So that's a similar related challenge of reproducibility. How do we resolve this question? And this is the value of, first of all, the danger of single studies, relying on single studies, the question of the quality of the study, which the decision maker may be interrogating and negotiating with. Should I trust this study? Okay, and the issue of using one study to make a decision. If you look at the value of the meta-analysis, okay, a study may show favorable outcomes, or it may be on the other side where it favors the comparator instead of the intervention. So that means that at any one point, the spurious findings of this study, bringing a value to synthesizing the evidence and coming up with a product. So yes, I agree that reproducibility is a challenge, but there's a way around it through evidence synthesis, so that the studies contribute to the overall goal, and we conduct, if they are quantitative studies, meta-analysis, okay, to inform decisions rather than using single studies. So yes, I'm in agreement with the caution of decision makers, but again, what is important is to develop trust with decision makers to the extent that even if you gave them your policy brief based on a single study, as long as it has the internal validity, optical information size, large sample size, and so on and so forth, that kind of study, I believe, should be useful. That is my view and my response round about the question. I hope I've satisfied your interest.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. OBUKU, and clearly, I think you've given it a fair justice, considering that, even small studies can actually inform practice eventually when they're combined in a meta-analysis or systematic review. The other question I had, in one of your measurements for productivity, you look at the publications. You also mentioned that Makerere College of Health Sciences introduced in 2011, they started making theses or dissertations publicly available. I wanted to know if you have an idea of how many of these dissertations are publicly available right now, what proportion of master's dissertations are publicly available, and whether these can also now be considered outputs rather than publications. And if they are considered outputs, how best can they be put so that they can actually be used by policymakers and decision makers? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, the primary measure for productivity was publication in peer-reviewed journals. The secondary ones included abstract presentation and also archiving these theses in repositories. There are two things that we found in our study. One, there was the time to uploading these theses improved from 10 years to 2.7 years over the study period. That is from 1996 cohort to the cohort that entered medical school in 2010. So there's a general improvement. And I'd like to imagine that it takes, probably now a year or immediately, because there's been improvement in the infrastructure of, ICT. It was 40%, which at that time, the average was 40% in my study or in this study of ours. But I believe now the average could have gone anywhere between 60 and 7%. Yes, my proposition to Makerere University would be to create what we call summaries, evidence summaries or research summaries as a beginning. Policy briefs might be a bit hard to ask for from postgraduate students, but we can begin with technical research summaries to really have policy meaning to these theses, so that again, they are digestible. These technical summaries are digestible by decision makers, as opposed to the whole thesis. It's quite big, and you have to have a lot of courage to read 100, 200 pages just to find, what you want. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Dr. Buku. Yeah, and I think summaries would be a good way to go. Do you know if the way that these theses are put, even if they are summaries, are they easy to search right now, or is that something that you would like to consider?
Yes, it's they are easily accessible. At least at that time when I looked at the work, which was about 4 years ago, it was easily accessible online. Something called DSpace, the institutional repository. They could have changed their web address, but it was easily accessible. And I used this database to corroborate the hard data on one, the files, the admission files, which had everything from admission to exit, and also the thesis themselves, the hard copies, which were the Directorate of Research and Graduate Training. So yes, they add value, and they're easily accessible at the moment. And I know globally now, the world is moving towards open access databases for thesis. I can't remember some offhand, but I think there's one called Open Gray, and there are others in the UK, some in the America, depending on the school of thought.
Okay, thank you. In the thesis, you mentioned that even availability of scholarship did not seem to improve publication rates. And this was quite interesting, in that people would imagine that when the postgraduate students have a scholarship, then they would have more time to concentrate on their studies and probably have a publication. Could you maybe give us an indication why this was the case? What does that scholarship cover, and what other things probably are not covered? What could explain this?
I'm not too sure. I didn't dig into that so much, but this was a finding in the multivariable regression model. We tested these variables individually, and initially what was promising was, the main variable, first of all, the main variable was the argument. Actually, sub-study 2 had a hypothesis, because this was, causality and using the central limit theorem and generalized linear models, for which we made the hypothesis that the type of school you are in, and at that time we thought if you're in public health, school of public health, then you're more likely to publish, you're more likely to, to move this thesis to a level where decision makers can pick up. But interestingly, what we found is that it was those of clinical nature, studies of clinical nature at the univariable analysis. But when we entered them in the multivariable model using multivariable logistic regression, what remained significant was age at entry into the program. And there was a negative adjusted coefficient of the regression, and it was minus 0.12, sort of a 12%, but I found it just hard to interpret that. And what again was important was the design. Research design in itself as a variable, because it was a combined variable looking at all the different types of studies, cohort, clinical trial, and so on. So when we investigated further, we found that the driver were the cohort studies. And we failed to interrogate what that was. But we thought that, maybe cohort studies are just too big for a student to handle. So probably these students who are embedded in cohorts which are pre-existing, complete with mentors. Now that brings me to the scholarship. I know today that there are scholarships which are aimed at publication. I'm not too sure whether scholarships at that time, for example, the Ministry of Health scholarship, which was predominant at that time, was requiring that you publish, and that could have been the issue. But today I see scholarships, from the US National Institute of Health, and I don't know whether McRiff also does scholarship for studying, but I know the Fogarty Fellowship does that, and those require publication. So my work may be limited by the period from 2011 to date, and things could have changed. And that's probably part of the limitation of my work, that it has been surpassed by events to some extent.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Obuku, for your response on that. And just to take on the cohort studies, and I think you clearly point out that probably the students were embedded on ongoing studies, because as you appreciate, setting up a cohort takes time, and a postgraduate master students may not have resources to do that. Is this a model that you would recommend? Should we encourage more of embedment, people like students linking up to ongoing studies? Is this a model that you think is worth exploring, as opposed to a case where every student is supposed to come up with a novel idea and set up from scratch? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I think that is one way to go, but cohorts are limited. But I'm a beneficiary of that from the Fogarty Fellowship. I published work from the DART cohort, which was a multi-country trial looking at the effect or the impact of HIV treatment in Africa at the JCRC. So I know the advantages is that you have secondary data, it is clean data, you can analyze it whichever way and develop your skill, but also publish work. So it's one way of doing it, but there are limitations on what we can do. And then, of course, cohorts tend to handle certain types of questions of effectiveness and follow-up and so on, which need longitudinal follow-up. Now, there are some questions like which entail framing the problem better. And you can see that type of work was also used in sub-study 3. If you look at the end of that table 3, the types of studies that were used in decision-making included 9 cross-sectional studies. So there's still value in cross-sectional studies, sort of independent cross-sectional studies aiding in planning. For example, the study by Musime and others at Mulago here mapped the etiology of enteric bacteria causing diarrhea. And this was using the IMCI guidelines. There are many more which were used to frame the problem. And therefore, the other observational design should not be underplayed. But yes, cohorts may tend to have resources, including mentors. I had access to Professor Mugenyi, Dr. Sisi Kitio, Professor Salata, Professor Mayanja, who are high hitters. And because they were in charge of the cohort, I had access to them. So I think the driver there could be access to mentorship. And as we saw from the systematic review by Wood and others in 2018 in the US, suggesting that mentorship is key. And what we need to do probably is to emphasize mentorship and support mentors and train them and come up with a mentorship program, including twinning programs. I was trained during my Fogarty Fellowship and found that very useful. What designs would I think of which would inform students and sharpen their skills? Systematic reviews. We are still a group of us. We started in 2007 alone, became more, started with systematic review in 2013, one of them. Now we publish systematic reviews. We are persuading the college that at least for doctoral students, let them start with systematic review to map the problem and better refine their questions to reduce replicability or reproducibility of the same question and say, just the context of Uganda, that kind of thing. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Obuku. Just taking you back to your first study on the systematic review, you included a number of papers, and I was just wondering, do you think the papers included in the systematic review could have missed some publications and also research uses by postgraduate students? And just anecdotally from my end, is that many students may not actually indicate that they're pursuing a postgraduate degree when they are making their publication. So there's danger of missing that. I don't know your thoughts. And just looking at the scoping review that you presented last, you indicate that there's quite a variety of, there's quite a range of outputs from the master's students by income status. What are your thoughts on whether the systematic review may have missed some outputs?
Thank you very much. A very, very important question. We intended to conduct, and maybe we can just have a theoretical discussion here, what we call investigation of publication bias, to the extent that you are unable to identify some studies, probably due to limitations of your search strategy. Now, being a PhD, ideally, I should have searched 5, 6, 7, 8 databases. I was limited by time and resources, but also the contestation or the tension between being a PhD student who is in charge of your work and having the whole team collect for you data, because I had at my disposal Alison here, but I tried to minimize her use, because yes, in the team we work together for big projects, but for the PhD I thought I should work on these methods alone, and that limited my opportunity to search 6, 7, 8 databases. So I stuck to 2 databases, PubMed, which has over 80% of the public health and clinical literature globally, and ERIC, which is the educational resources databases, covering the globe. And that was the minimum criteria proposed by what we call the AMSTA 2 guideline, which is really a guideline that tells you, it's the Bible of how you should strengthen systematic review method. So I met the minimum guideline, but it's possible because I was at the minimum just to fulfill what was manageable by a PhD student. I could have missed studies. And in fact, as I was conducting the scoping review, I discovered I missed one study in Peru, which was, I think, in Portuguese. That could have been the reason I missed it. And then there was a study in Turkey. So yes, it's possible that I missed them. But when I looked at the proportions, the proportion of students who are publishing, they were within the confidence interval of 7%, for the fixed effects meta-analysis, to 29%, which is the upper bound confidence limit for the random effect meta-analysis. And I was comfortable that, I could have missed them, and I did a crude, publication bias analysis and found that very, very important. Now, in systematic reviews, we included studies which had studied study. And this tends to confuse us, that we didn't include an individual study of a postgraduate student. No, we included, for example, a study, the biggest study we included by Ozgen and others, did a study in Turkey looking at 22,625 theses over 40 years. You're seeing, so that was one study contributing just 22,000. Of course, there was a skewing with this study contributing 92% of the data in the fixed effects model. And that's why we went for a random effects model. And I think we, in many ways, estimated the proper range and the proper, an acceptable range, and the statistically, should I say statistically, the probability of the true value lying within the confidence interval covered what would have been in the publication bias. Otherwise, ideally, I should have done a funnel plot or run Eggers test, but I thought, some of these things really come up with the same thing to look at small study effects. The studies were few, but the general sample size came to about 27,000 theses. So really, using the central limit theorem and probability theorem, we can, diminish the role of chance on that one. In terms of income status, well, this borrows, of course, from previous studies, what we call ecological studies, looking at GDP and relating it to scientific productivity, and that relationship, the correlation is towards 1 on that one, and it's self-explanatory. It's really how much we invest in research, and therefore we should encourage African governments to proportionally increase their investment in research. I'm particularly impressed that Uganda now has begun, due to the COVID pandemic, investing even in clinical trials, in some of these interventions.
And thank you, Dr. Buku. Yeah, so for the next, my next question is on, you mentioned that part of the research outputs in terms of productivity are conference presentations. Those were part of the secondary measures of productivity. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on how easy are the conference presentations for use by policy and decision makers, given that they have not been peer reviewed and also synthesized, like going through that evidence cycle? What are your thoughts on that? Should they be considered parts of productivity, especially if your ultimate aim is to get them into policy and to be used by policymakers and decision makers?
Yes, first of all, I must underscore the fact that we grossly underestimated the proportion of studies that made it to conferences. For example, when I dug down and looked at them, I did not find my father's thesis, yet he had presented it in a conference in Madrid. So I actually, yesterday I wrote to them, I said, because I looked back, I said, maybe I get it and ask me this question tomorrow. So I dug, but I sent them an email. I said, you send me that. By this morning, they hadn't sent it. So we said 2% were presented in conferences, but those are conferences which documented their proceedings online. I know in Makerere University, for instance, there have been several conferences, and more recently, the situation has improved. There's something called JASH, Joint Annual, I think, Scientific Conference in Health, where students, I've seen them present these abstracts. More recently, as I said, my study could have been surpassed by events. People are presenting outside the country. So what is the story around conference, around abstracts? Abstracts in systematic reviews are considered gray literature. Yes, they may not be conclusive, but at times it's what we have. Sometimes to make a decision, and what you have is what you use at times. It is discouraged because it doesn't give you full information, but yes, it's an output to an extent that you are able to give out some information, although of course, you need the full breadth of the research. You need several studies contributing to evidence synthesis, like systematic review, evidence and gap maps, and so on and so forth, to make decisions rather than relying on single studies. So I would say, even if a publication is a single publication, the world is moving towards a co-production of evidence and having more optimal information size to make decisions as opposed to using single studies. So an abstract would be considered a single study, and typically having information that is not very useful, but it's a guide also. Once you find an abstract, then you can start looking for the thesis, for example, and therefore it becomes important. The other advantage of conference presentations is that you begin to enter the world of scholarly work, which is desirable for students whom we think would take up a research career. I did not explore the relationship between the abstract presentation and whether they published or not, and that would have been a wonderful question there. That's my response.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Obuku. And I think you bring out an important point of meetings and conferences where abstract and posters are not published as conference proceedings, where people miss this. So I think it's also important that if, as you say, that this could be indicators for where people should look for evidence, like pointers that if there was this abstract presented by such a scientist in a meeting, then probably look out for their publication or their dissertation somewhere. But you realize that there are lots of meetings where this may not be published and they are not available. In your thesis, you mention a lot, you don't mention much about conceptual use of research, which probably for obvious reasons. Is it easy to measure? How do you measure it actually? And is it just impossible to measure?
So I must admit, I did not present, of course, everything. I reached 43 minutes and I'd done a bit of talking. People are beginning to yawn. I did not present the limitations and strengths, and I could just mention them because I know them. So part of the limitations was the choice of the proxy of citations as a measure of research use. Clearly, that wouldn't capture conceptual use. conceptual use, according to Carol Weiss and other colleagues who have developed these models of how we can, circumscribe the animal called use of research, would be merely interfacing with those who have the information. For instance, as I gave you a very good example, the House of Lords, people from the House of Lords who are interacting with the professors in bars in the UK, and this impacted the social sector policies because knowledge diffused from the professors to the decision makers, okay? And this is the conceptual use. So when the decision maker hits Parliament and makes arguments, they cannot cite a specific research that they use, but it has permeated through the interaction with those who have knowledge. And that is what is known as diffusion of knowledge. So conceptual use would call for other methodologies, typically qualitative in nature, including the researcher embedding himself or herself in, for example, technical working groups of the Ministry of Health. Many of these documents, according to my colleague, Ngolo Zogo Pierre, who did a study looking at, use of evidence in Uganda and Cameroon, and found that actually citation was limited in these policy-related documents, especially previously, and therefore has limitations in, for example, capturing conceptual use or whether use was used at all. So measuring use would need, anthropological approaches or ethnography, being part of a district health team and how they apply research at that level when they are generating their decisions or their bylaws and so on and so forth. I've been fortunate to be part of, for example, the discussions around the amendment of the Public Health Act, and many times we saw the application of evidence in many of the areas, for example, immunization and so on and so forth. So yes, difficult to measure because it's real time and conceptual use. The methods are quite different, quite elaborate. And although if you look at my conceptual framework down there, wanted to look at the characteristics of the researcher, but we didn't get the opportunity to interact with them because of time limitations, much as I took quite a bit of time to accomplish this work.
Okay, thank you for your response. For your second study in Makerere, how could citation practices affect your findings? And I'll just think of cases where people do not cite primary research, but instead cite papers that have cited the primary research. Were you able to, how do you pick out this where somebody, instead of citing primary research, goes on and maybe cites a systematic review or cites a paper that cited the primary research? In that case, if we do not pick that out, then you may end up missing papers that have actually been used. Could your findings have been affected by citation practices?
It's possible, of course, it's possible. There's always room for such practices to affect the citation. However, we circumscribed and improved the, should I say, the validity of our measure by sticking, our measure of use, by sticking to citation. Lots of criticisms on using citation alone because you miss out a lot. You actually, it's the tip of the iceberg on evidence use. But the fact that we wanted to look out for direct citation, where, for instance, in the study by Dr. Pimbaza Arthur looking at the importance of midazolam compared to rectodiazepam in managing intractable seizures in malaria and other conditions, they cited until the study by Pimbaza and others, which was the biggest with 330, showed that there were side effects of respiratory nature, when you use midazolam. So that's what we stuck to. And this was the most difficult part of the work because we were embedded in those files, you can see, then working all the way to Google Scholar, going back to PubMed and making sure, and the journals and the policy-related documents. That's why, in fact, we decided to focus on the policy-related documents. Otherwise, the citations were quite about 200, and we thought that would be postdoctoral work.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dr. Buku, for that, your response. The other question I had is, we know that once you have your manuscript and you submit, one of the biggest challenges for journals where people want to publish is the article processing fee, where people have to put publication fee. Probably you did not probably have time to interrogate this deeply in your thesis, but could this be a barrier, or is it something to find out where people say, I would really want to publish in by quote prestigious journal, but that prestigious journal I need 1,500 pounds or dollars, and I don't have that, so they give up and go away. Could that be a barrier?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Akech, for that very, very important question. And even the other ones have been very important and very relevant, and guiding me to think through better through this thesis. And I have no doubt after this, I'll improve this writer. The phenomenon you're talking about is publication bias. And publication bias is all the way in the value chain from the researcher themselves. They are biased. They don't want to publish in the other journal. They want the so-called A journal or the high impact factor journal. And that has brought about the criticism of impact factor as a limitation, in assessing whether a journal is valuable, because, the way they calculate impact factor is they look at the current year and the previous year citations divided by, the research output. And in publication bias, the second level is the reviewer, who may be biased. The third level, of course, is the editor. But also there's a publication bias secondary to, the journal being behind the paywall. But the advantage of this is some clever people came about with something called Creative Commons license, and it's what has permitted me to actually show the papers here, reproduce them. The Creative Commons license permits for, open access. And open access journals, the thinking is that someone else will pay for it, say from high income countries, and facilitate the publication of this work. It is possible. I didn't carry out this work, but this is something, again, as I said, giving me ideas for postdoctoral work, that I could go out there and examine and say, how many of this work was actually in open access journal, and look at the trend. It is more likely that previously, we had the New England Journal, the British Medical Journal, and so on. But now we have more open access journal, the BMC series, PLOS One, and so on. And we also have our local journals, which are well established, like the African Health Sciences. So the opportunity to publish, and also the Uganda Medical Association Journal, Uganda Medical Journal, is also there somewhere, And so these opportunities are there today compared to yesterday, and therefore it is possible that publication fees limited how they could publish. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that is one of the barriers which we didn't explore and would require interacting with the students, to get that information using qualitative methods.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Obuku. Yeah, really worth exploring further. In the systematic review, the production and use seem to have been higher in Togo compared to Turkey. I saw, I think for production was 6 versus 41%. Why was there this big difference between Togo and Turkey? I think this is probably something you didn't explore, but do you have some thoughts? Because people would think that Turkey, being slightly a higher income country, should have better productivity compared to Togo. Was there something about this studies, how studies are done in Togo, that improves their productivity? What nature of studies could they be? Just your thoughts on why such a difference and what we could learn.
Yes, very, very important. I hadn't thought about it. Although we ran a meta-regression, exploring the people, population of interest, intervention, and so on. We ran a meta-regression, but I think we ran a meta-regression to explore the differences of time. We also ran a meta-regression. I don't remember the other 3 variables. I need to open my book here. It will take me some time. But it's a question we would have run using a meta-regression. But I'm encouraged by the quick and clean scoping review we just did, which showed that the recent studies are from Turkey. There's something going on in Turkey. They are evaluating many of their PG research. The bulk of the studies out there from low and middle income countries is from Turkey. And it is actually the more recent studies, 53% okay? It's 53% higher than the one of Togo, 41%. So to me, I would say this is these values are randomly distributed around the true estimate, particularly using the thinking of random effects meta-analysis. So this difference may actually not be necessarily true. One study from Togo, several from Turkey would need to do a sub-meta-analysis looking at country level performance, and then maybe see whether they fall within their confidence intervals overlap. So that's my thinking. It's probably not a true finding, but it's possible for lower income countries to produce research much more than higher income countries, depending on their investment portfolio, in terms of going for what we call low cost, high impact interventions. Typically, high income countries would go for high cost and high impact probably interventions.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dr. Boku, for that. Yeah, and it's something really worth also just trying to find out if digging it further could actually pick out some enablers for increasing productivity. My other question relates to Makerere. You mentioned that you divided this study periods into 3, and then you note that publications became faster in the 3rd period. What might have caused this? Any enablers for this, and anything we can learn from this?
Yes,
any enablers in the 3rd period? Yeah.
Yes, the thinking was that the first, so we divided into 3 periods. The period between 1996 to 2000, and the thinking was that is the pre-MDG goals, the social development goals period. And this period we thought was influenced by a call from the so-called 1090 gap. There was a movement towards improving the investment in research in countries where 90% of the problem existed, and moving that investment from 10% towards something more acceptable. So this was the core initiative, and we thought that influenced how research was done. To the extent to which these students were exposed to that, probably not so much, but through the priorities at that time, probably that influenced how much people published and what they published in. And we thought immediately after that, the MDGs influenced the thinking of anybody who wants to publish, as a global goal. And after 2006, after 2010, we thought the ministerial conference in Bamako, 2007 and 2008 in Mexico, those two influenced the publication outputs of several research institutions, and this was very well documented, even in Uganda here by my colleague in this program called Pierre. So yes, my thinking therefore was the general climate. What in the first model by Levis and Sawankambo and others, they call among the elements they call the general climate, the funding climate, the appetite for research, the appetite for accountability could have improved over time. The second aspect could have been the beginning of certain mentorship programs at the college, the increase in funding probably, as evidenced by the institutions which were established by faculty, the Rakai Health Sciences program, which probably provided cohorts, the JCRC, which provided cohorts and provided opportunity for placement, the Infectious Disease Institute where I work, which provided cohorts as well, or opportunities for further research. And the funding environment could have improved, the opportunities could have improved, the desire to publish could have permeated from the senior researchers to the junior researchers, and that very difficult to document could have been the reason explaining why over time this could have changed and reduced the time to publication. Peer influence as well could have been important in informing the publication reduction, the median time to publication. That's my thought really. The global environment, the local environment, then the interactive behavior between the PGs, saying my colleague has published, let me also publish, something like that. I don't know.
In any role, yeah, and I think you mentioned many things, including maybe the funding environment. So maybe just to go to the next question.
Maybe just to circumscribe that, it's possible that some programs maybe, I don't know whether they had started at that time. These were medical education partnership initiatives providing scholarships, I think starting from graduate level, and maybe Fogati. I cannot remember when they started, the Sawan scholarships were at higher level and so on, but there could have been something going on that improved the opportunities for graduate students to participate in research and see value in publishing.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Oboku. Yeah, you mentioned in the thesis that most citing policy documents were mostly by international organizations and for infectious diseases. There were not many from, let's say, Uganda citing any of this research. So does this allude to anything about who is trusted to write policy, or who has capability to write policies, or what would explain that even for research that has policy relevance, it was mostly finding place in international organizations and, yeah, largely infectious diseases?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ketch, for that important question. I think the question you ask brings about one of the biases, which would be selection bias, that the studies which were available to us were those which were properly indexed, or the policy-related documents, those which were properly indexed and those which were kept well, online. Otherwise, I have no doubt professors at Makerere University participate in technical working groups, in policy dialogues, and use research to inform, Ministry of Health policy-related documents and guidelines, as particularly clinical guidelines, which were the predominant. But also they participate at WHO level. Professors from Makerere, for example, participated at WHO, have participated in writing, requests for information for drug-resistant tuberculosis as early as 10 years ago. So we participate. People from Uganda participate. But how we keep records, how we cite this work, is what, of course, cannot be touched. You can't see it. It's not tangible. But I have no doubt research is used. So it's just a selection bias. A WHO document, is more likely to be found having cited research compared to, say, Ministry of Health document.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your response to that. We just to ask you just a related question. Now, imagine a situation whereby you've done your research, since you've done your research, done your publication, and then prepare a brief on that. And then you take it to a decision maker or policy makers in the country. And I'm just trying to look at the power play and the complex environment in which research gets adopted into policy. What are your thoughts about the confidence of local policymakers, in-country policymakers? How do they treat evidence briefs that would be presented to them versus existing WHO policy or guidance? Would they use that for decision making, or would they have to wait for WHO? And could that explain why, for example, you are not seeing much efforts from the college in trying to get this, because maybe there's that frustration? Your thoughts?
Yes, my quick thoughts. Every publisher typically, especially, if you look at the Levis and Sawan-Cambo model, model A was push efforts. So purveyors or producers of research like Makerere University produce the research, publish it, and say, those guys at Ministry of Health, they are not serious. They can't even look at my work. I already solved that problem. It's typical. But I think there is a move towards engagement. I have seen a grand round on malaria being organized by the College of Health Sciences and the National Malaria Control Program. These are welcome moves. The Ministry of Health invited professors from Makerere University to be part of the scientific committee for COVID-19. All right, we began to see really high-level decision-making following science, which was very, very important. We are also aware, of course, literature is awash to systematic reviews. Looking at what facilitates the uptake of research. One of them, as you mentioned correctly, is trust. And these trust relationships are developed between the researcher, the purveyor of research, and the user. 1, 2, 3 times, take that document, if it supports them in making decisions, they will call on you. Colleagues I know have been called upon, to provide evidence even at individual basis by preparing rapid response briefs. The other one, of course, which is an inhibitor, the aspect of power play comes about when a policy intervention is going to cause someone to lose out. There are losers. Every policy intervention has losers, brings in policy problems. The budget may be shifted from your desk. So that power and budget struggle tends to affect whether research will be adopted or not. In terms of local evidence, as I said, in Uganda, there have been multiple evaluations of the knowledge translation platforms. And one thing that was found that was important in pushing research forward was local evidence to help with implementation feasibility. This was a study by Sengoba and colleagues from Makerere University published in 2011, which looked at that aspect. So yes, decision makers actually, some are even hesitant to take down WHO guidance, are waiting local evidence to sort of, compare context. Oh, that one was done there. We need to see what is in Uganda, but not necessarily repeating the same study, but providing what we call formative evaluations to see whether the health system can absorb this intervention. And there are many which we can talk about, hydroxychloroquine and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Obuku, for your insights into that. I'm just almost coming towards the end of my questions. One thing I wanted, you mentioned in your thesis towards the conclusion that there's need to increase engagement with end users of the research, who are basically policy and decision makers. First of all, I wanted to understand who need to catalyze this, and any role for institutions for like Makerere College of Health Sciences. And then through that engagement, is there a risk also that research with insufficient evidence may actually risk being implemented? If you may get a very good engagement, but then end up having research with insufficient evidence being being implemented just because of the relationship that has developed. And when you think about how you get into guidance, you start from those single studies and do your systematic review, your evidence synthesis, and get guidelines. So just your thoughts on that.
Again, thank you very much, Dr. Akech, for that important question. I believe, as I said, one of the shortcomings of doing a PhD for almost a decade is that by the time you present, people are already implementing solutions. So I believe at the School of Public Health, some of these things are happening. I see the public health programs are placing students in, at the districts. They go and do some research work, which may not necessarily, again, be really their thesis, and help in solving local problems. So that's one important aspect. The proposition you are making, I take you back again to the Levy's model. Levy's model shows the fourth model D. Model D, I don't know if I can show it here, but not necessary. That model D is comprehensive. It has all players. It's called the KTP. And the highest level, which has, they are fortunate to have it, is National Institute of Health Care and Clinical Excellence in the UK, where, I was there in 2012, and even patients, contribute to decision making. I'll give you an example. The UK had put a ban on, a cost effectiveness upper limit of £23,000. So if you did the cost effectiveness analysis, and the number needed to treat the cost of that costed £23,000 per patient, they would not take it up. So they removed a drug based on side effects, skin rash. So the patient movement came about and said, we want that drug back. And the reason was, they said, when we get a rash, this is in the UK, we know the drug is working. And they put back the drug, but they had kicked it off. Why? Because of the knowledge translation platform, which even avails patient groups to come about. So at the Ministry of Healthcare, who would catalyze this? One would need to do a stakeholder mapping and engagement. Who is available today? Ghana National Health Research Organization, the Ministry of Health itself, and the purveyors of research, like Makerere University, can start these programs of really pushing students there. Now, we talked about insufficient evidence. Yes, it's possible, but again, there's the issue I talked about, the danger of using single studies and the idea of synthesizing evidence, particularly local evidence, to inform implementation. And therefore, yes, you may use one study, but use implementation science models to pilot, do formative evaluation before scaling up using, step-weight cluster randomized trials. But I would also like to conclude with a comment that, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Sometimes we stick so much on evidence, but the decisions are made on values. I was in a meeting, a Cochrane meeting in Quebec, and a lady from Washington stood up and said, guys, you're here talking evidence, but I can tell you, evidence just generates discussion. We make decisions based on politics. And that's when I said, Professor Wankambu, I didn't know we are down there trying to cause change, but we have limitations to the extent to which evidence plays a role in final decision making. Values play a role, and then of course preferences. And as I told you, at times, as I argued here and showed that sometimes evidence is used symbolically. In fact, the variant of symbolic is tactical. Sometimes people delay using evidence until it's appropriate. We saw this in the Anti-Homosexuality Act when it was being passed. At times, people use evidence politically. Okay, so that happens every once in a while. So evidence is just one of the ingredients in the policy pie or the pizza, if you like. There are other players who influence the decision, and not only evidence.
Okay, yeah, just thank you for that, Dr. Boku. Two last questions, and one is just going back to the basic, more to the student. In your thesis, you mentioned that there were cases where the students were not always the first author. I was wondering what may be explaining this. What could be happening where somebody does a dissertation, but they end up not being the first author? What may have happened?
Thank you very much. So I need to report this in two ways. This, of course, in the general discussion of the whole thesis, I had to synthesize this as one point. But this finding came about from the systematic review, and I think there were 6 studies contributing a number of theses, 6 studies, but they were outside Uganda. For Makerere's case, I think I only found one study by Alia, which was published. The first author was Dr. Wicks, obstetrician, and Alia was second author, but 99.99%, and that was encouraging. At Makerere University, they were first authors. However, the range was from 23% to 80% as first authors, meaning that in some situations, up to 80% of the first authors were the mentors. And that, of course, authorship is prestigious. When I made my first publication, I had to move around and tell people, I've also published, and that was important, maybe less so today because, 30 and so on. Okay, so it's prestigious, that with academic advantages. And at times, what could be happening is that a student may be embedded in a project of a senior researcher, and the researcher maybe requires 1 or 2 papers to get to the next promotion of associate professor and says, you know what, you are just going to be second author. And that power play comes about, there's someone who's more powerful than you, has given you the funds and, requests to publish the work. It could be that the thesis is lying down there. You talk to the student. I mean, I've had this situation. I've supervised over 10 students. Some students we've published together. I'm never first author, okay? But some students you feel like publishing, and if you publish the work at times as a corresponding author, you may as well be the first author. So that could explain it. Good enough in Makerere, that's not the case here. So I think it's the student mentorship relationship, but I'm here to explore more of this, to understand why this is the case. That would need, engaging students outside Uganda, because in Uganda, that's not the case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Buku. And then my final question is around your recommendation that there's need for more engagement when setting up research priorities or research questions, there need to be engagement with decision makers and also with other players. This may work, but this definitely has obvious benefits in terms of the uptake of that research when it comes out. But I was wondering whether you may want to put a caution to that, given that some novel research may not always seem as an obvious priority to decision makers and even other players. And one example would be that if, let's say, 10 years ago, you are mostly studying common colds and trying to understand what causes common colds and all this, people would say, so we all get common colds and get fine with it. And so why study it? That was until Corona came and people saw that, oh, so people who probably have been studying common colds and understand this, then probably they already had ideas and they had made progress in how to tackle coronavirus. So what are your thoughts about the place of novel research when you're actually trying to deal with decision makers and other players in identifying the research question and priority?
It's a very, very important question, Dr. Cage. Thank you so much. I think it's an issue of economics. Resources are scarce, and therefore we must prioritize our resources on what research we are going to do. It was very evident when recently in the parliament, they could not believe that the government had invested a few millions of dollars, to look for a COVID vaccine, look for COVID solutions like diagnostics, and it raised uproar. And that happens because many a time we are used to that investment portfolio coming from international organizations and improves believability, but it's possible. The question you're talking about is very, very important in terms of what we call embedded knowledge translation. I'll give you an example. That first study I talked about, I published in 2011. We included a question to ask about priorities. So here we are in Namuongo, in Lira, in Wobulenzi, asking about tuberculosis. So, but when we asked them, but what are your priority health problems? I will tell you in Namuongo, which was a World Bank project, which was run down to become a slum, their problem was drainage, okay? Their problem was malaria. And here we are, it was a small study, 22,000 pounds, looking for knowledge, attitudes, and practices about health-seeking behavior on tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was down at less than 10%. Malaria was towards 90%. And that really cements the idea that whose research are we doing? For who is going to use it? And brings about embedded knowledge translation. The Levis and McMaster group and the so on are talking about embedded knowledge translation. Involve the decision makers, involve the research users, including the community, by the way, at the beginning of setting priorities. And this is the direction, the co-production of evidence, the so-called co-production of evidence movement is taking. Finally, I would like to underscore a very important thing. Yes, I could have said decision makers, but probably I could improve that statement and say research users. And at the end of my thesis, I asked, to what extent is the Uganda Manufacturers Association involved in setting priorities at medical school? We use masks. Sometimes we lack these things in the health system, okay? Gloves. But to what extent have we been part of the process in developing PPE, for example, which works with Uganda Manufacturers Association? After COVID-19, the situation may improve. And to me, that is the representation of priority setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. OBUKU, for your presentation and also responding to my questions. I would like to thank you for doing quite a good piece of work which actually tries to address the problem of research waste. And as you mentioned, a lot of efforts go into defining those research questions, recruiting participants, and also putting up those dissertations. And if they are not published and also taken up by decision makers, then that is contributes to research waste. So thank you very much. And at this point, I would like to take back to the chair. Yeah, thank you.
Understand a lot more the work that went on. And I know that there are other panelists waiting to ask questions. So maybe I'll ask going forward, Dr. Buku, to try and be a bit concise so that we manage time. We have an activity coming up at 2, so we don't want to be late for it. So thank you, Dr. Kate. So please stay on and enjoy the rest of the defense. So at this juncture, I'm happy to invite Dr. Susan Chiwanuka to interact with Dr. Buku as well.
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope the mic is working. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to read the work of Dr. Obuku. I found it quite an interesting read, but I won't waste a lot of time in flattering him. So I'll get straight to the questions. Dr. Obuku, based on your learning from literature around knowledge translation, research and evidence use, you stated 2 assumptions in your thesis. The first one was that postgraduate students in health institutions of higher learning produce research for the consumption of health decision makers, okay? And your second assumption was that policymakers would apply this information if made aware of it. Now, if you get the universe of what you know about knowledge translation, how valid are your assumptions?
Very important question. Thank you, Dr. Susan. The issue of whether those assumptions are valid takes me back to the thesis. I have supervised quite a number of students. I've read some of these theses. I haven't done a thesis at master's level because at the University of London, you have to do a thesis. But I appreciated that aspect of the significance of as the significance justification. It really changed policy and practice somewhere. And the decision maker can be just at the ward in Mulago where they have identified the problem. I remember my colleague, Dr. Peter Chibuka, studied something to do with use of metrometers or, you know, in pregnancy, and it was an advice control trial. I think it changed practice there at that level at Mulago. I don't remember where it was. Where I have challenges, of course, and probably discount the validity of that assumption is the research use. And the research used by decision makers comes about from several aspects. One, research may not be used to make the decision in the first place, be it research from a professor or postgraduate student. Now, when you talk about a postgraduate student, where the general notion is this research is done to improve research methods. You know, some of the colleagues I met said, but when you're a master's student, you're just supposed to pass, learn how to collect data.
Yes.
But the counter thesis to that is that some of the research we saw, Dr. Cheng's work is a randomized control trial, went up to WHO level. Dr. Chan's work was the only other study that contributed to the optimal information size and narrowed the confidence interval with diamond. You can see Dr. Kambugu's work, even Dr. Musime's work. It was just a cross-sectional study to really look at the cause of this and that. Became very important in defining the etiology. So this is to encourage all postgraduate students who are listening and their mentors that actually your work may be used, but whether it will be used, the probability from this work is only 20% that it will be used, but it may be used. But again, there is this argument of research does not expire. Research does not expire, but it has also to be relevant. So there is a tension there, and that's really my response to it. Right.
I'll take that. Your literature review brings out many uses of research, okay? And you've touched on that in your response. And yet you focus only on publication, which happens not to be the primary goal of students, okay? I know many students in this room, when they get into the university, They are not seeking to influence policy. They are seeking to get a certificate. And publication is not their primary goal, okay? And you conclude that because they did not publish, this research is wasted. Do you feel you give value to the student or the institutions producing these students by labeling this a wastage if it wasn't the primary goal?
So a number of things, and thanks again for those intriguing questions. I'm beginning to think I need more water. You know, there are those that are facts. And as you know, our scholars build on previous scholars' work. A senior colleague, Ian Chalmers, and he's from Bashot, Lazoo, have argued in a paper in 2009, another one in 2012, you know, that for heaven's sake, research from thesis, which is not acceptable, is even an injustice, which is not accessible, so is an injustice to the scientific community. You're doing a disservice to your patients if you go and bring them, draw blood, okay? Get that information, put it in the library. When the library is full, it goes to the dustbin. So that's one counter argument. The other counter argument is, which of course speaks to this, is the cost. In the discussion, I did a crude estimation this morning, and it was $1 million, you know, low bound. Conservative estimate. Why do this research? Yes, many reasons for doing this research. They are competing interests. Majority by far do it to get their degree and move on. And we acknowledge that in our discussion. And that could explain the 82% non-publication, because it needs effort. Let's look at the professor I spoke to yesterday. She's an African woman in science. She's impactful. She's leading science. And it's when I saw that I realized I had not seen her thesis. I said, maybe I missed, maybe my methods missed your thesis. And she confessed and said, no, I did publish. I hadn't got the fever yet. So the appetite to publish is influenced by career choices as well. And of course, that to some extent limits my assumption, and I agree with you that limits my assumption. It needs to be made stronger.
Okay, so in that case, I would advise that in the revision of your book, you nuance that those conclusions that it's a waste. I would rather you put it as a missed opportunity rather than a wastage, because it came out strongly that this is a waste, yet we are pushing out graduates every day. One of the hallmarks of a PhD is for the student to be able to come out with the ability to take different perspectives in mind. So when you approach this work, just like economists, when they're doing economic evaluations, they take different perspectives, the patient's perspective, the provider, the policymaker, the society. Whose perspective did you take? And were you able to balance those perspectives as you draw conclusions from your research? What was your positionality in this work? And did you look at the other positions, the institutions, the students, in order to draw your conclusions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzanne Chonka. Very, very important question. And as I said, of course, you have the benefit of reading the thesis. I did show some of the slides here in the limitations. One of the limitations and propositions for next steps in terms of research is to examine the views in all fairness of the mentors or the supervisor, because there could be system challenges. You know, it was shown that one way of improving research is to have good internet access and infrastructure. And from Professor Nakanjako's study showed that also mentors did support. And I recognize that limitation of not having looked at the perspective of the decision maker, of the supervisor. I also did not look at the perspective of the institution. I actually did some interviews, about 8, but the work was becoming a lot. So I said, Prof, my supervisor, I'm going to look at that as a postdoc, because I thought I had enough to publish. So yes, I took an objective view of a researcher, but then the lens was limited from the perspective of, say, the director of graduate studies. I have the data there, but I didn't tease it out, therefore didn't use it. And that is a big gap, which I think I could acknowledge better.
Okay, I hope you do. So, Dr. Obuku, the other issue I had, or I am seeking clarification. Your conceptual framework was mostly based on the push model of research utilization. Yet you are so well versed with what happens in knowledge translation. Why? Why did you just focus on the push model? Between you and I, we know how well the push model works.
Yes, thank you very much for saying between you and I, making me feel I'm soon going to become a senior lecturer. Now, yes, I've actually realized, in reading for this exam, I noticed that in my conceptual framework, down there under the characteristics of the research user, I didn't handle that aspect very well. And I acknowledge that as a limitation. But I thought that this study would provide a baseline for especially planning from the perspective of the pushers, okay, investor, to begin considering establishing platforms for KTP where there is interaction. Because even the pool model itself, it depends on demand, and demand, as you know, in economics can go down. And yet, it may go down for various factors, including the research user may not be knowledgeable. Give an example, you may change a commissioner in an office, and the previous commissioner used to demand for research. This happens especially when they establish relationship. We have seen it happen at the African Center. At one time, we were called, to talk about, some drug-resistant mosquito net. But after some time, you are not called, the commissioner has changed. So demand can also vary. So the ideal would be this platform like this, where all are there together, but who starts that? The purveyors of research, and I think Dr. Cage asked that, is it the purveyors of research who should catalyze it, or the users of research? So yes, the limitation, but I think that is the direction to take.
Okay, and I think you would acknowledge that and perhaps discuss around the models, the most effective models for research uptake, so that your recommendations are founded in the more effective approaches. I'm running through this, but one of the things that struck me, Dr. Obuku, was that I know that PhD students have a stronger mandate to publish and generate evidence for policy, and they also have a longer time to engage and interact with the potential use of the research. Why did you exclude the PhD students in the studies, the thesis you assessed? Why?
Thank you so much, Dr. Chonka. The answer lies in what you have said. I thought they were a different context. When I kept studying, at that time, in 2011, there were the 2011 report of the College of Health Sciences showed 42 completed PhDs and 46 ongoing. And I wanted to explore that further. Okay, I wanted to explore that further. And it would have been prospective. I was thinking of a prospective model and changing my research design. But one that discouraged me was the fact that for them it is required to publish. And in any case, you can't graduate without publishing at least two. So I thought that context is different from postgraduate students who, who are either self-motivated, and I recognize the self-efficacy, self-drive, the discussion, or could just have good mentors. So I excluded them for that reason, principally. But also, I had not circumscribed the exact question. I had not circumscribed the exact question that would add value from them, and I thought I can do this in postdoc. However, in the systematic review, I tried to delineate them, and it's after exploring the systematic review, I saw maybe let me just exclude them and make and improve the generalizability of my finding to master students rather than a blanket one for postgraduate whose rules are different. Those roles are different, PG and PhD. But also, although those, for example, one reason I excluded the high income countries also is the same reason. You find that in the US, for example, doctors in residence are doing a 3rd degree. Okay, they first do a 1st degree, then do medical school, then residence is actually a PhD. So they were rarely comparable to doctors whose 2nd degree, whose MMed is actually 2nd degree. That's one reason. The differences were that the people in high income countries, especially outside UK and these Commonwealth, were actually equivalent. PhDs, DDS, Doctor of Dental Surgery, and MD, Doctor of Medicine.
Okay. The reason I brought this up is that my observation is at a PhD level, you have a seasoned researcher who is able to engage, I'm assuming, but I've engaged with some of them. And they're able to engage and perhaps fit more in the KTP model of engagement and interaction, and even perhaps representation at TWGs. Whereas a master level student might not have the same privilege unless they have an uncle or auntie with tall legs. So they might not get into the same corridors of power as someone who is more seasoned. So I thought that there was a gap on touching on that level of scholarship within the university. You have a different crop of students who come in at a PhD level. But you could touch on that perhaps as a gap and acknowledge the limitation. In your study,
there is an antithesis to that. There's an antithesis to that because of the 16 cases where the research was actually used. And this morning I met one of them, said, do you know that your research was actually used? Said, hey, it was. So you see, sometimes even research that is not published was used. For instance, although there was correlation with citation at 0.8 months, there were, I think, 25 or 38, which came directly from thesis. The guy didn't bother to publish, just put his thesis in, but people look for great literature and got it. So that's an antithesis to that argument that PhDs would drive decision making. And in many ways, even sometimes ask myself, but is PhD what? So that's something. The PhD next in the PhD. Yes.
Okay, actually, you bring me to my next question. You say in your results that you found 5% research use in policy documents. 4%-ish. Does that differ from regular researchers? And if so, by how much? Because generally, I know that there is low use or perhaps citation in policy documents. So if you find that 4% for these postgraduate students who come in to get their degrees anyway, but get fortunate enough to be cited in a policy document, does that statistic differ across the general population?
So two things, and thanks again. One is that the intention of the study was to demonstrate, to really find out that does it in any way contribute to decision making. Postgraduates, why? Because whereas they say it's not their drive. That was the intention, not to necessarily compare the two, because the two are incomparable. Yeah, funded research compared to funded established program research to determine whether insecticide mosquito treated nets, are effective, whether IRS is effective in eliminating malaria, compared to a student who has a short time here and has to graduate. So I thought the two would have been different. So first of all, I didn't study that. But you raise very important question. What encourages me is that there's been an evolution. There has been an evolution, even at the epitome of research use at WHO, that paper by Oxman and Levis and Frightham, which I'm sure you're aware about, demonstrated that 20 years ago, WHO was here. Today, you cannot pass a decision through WHO without thorough consultation, through research, interrogation, through the great process for almost all the documents that I'm aware about. I am privileged, like you are, to sit in one or two meetings of the Ministry of Health, and we tap into the WHO guidelines and customize them. So in many ways, we use the research even when we don't know it, because some people have already processed it for us. Where there could be challenges would be the formative evaluations which are needed to now contextualize the implementation consideration.
I asked that question because I wanted to bring out the fact that perhaps the percentage for these graduate students does not really differ from the general population, indicating a culture which needs to be targeted at the root rather than at postgraduate level. The fact that a lot of research is really, as we define it, cited, because we assess it on citations in documents. So could it demand for us to look for an alternative way to assess research use rather than focusing only on citation and publication? Because we could be missing so much because of our academic focus on citations. That's what I wanted to bring out with that question. My final question. Based on your work and your knowledge of the field as a university, although you didn't take the perspective of the university, what do you think the institution can do to help postgraduate students, whether at master's or at PhD level, to enhance the uptake of their evidence? You mentioned some of that, but I had a contention with putting students on technical working groups, master's students. You mentioned that as a proposal in one of your slides. And technical working groups listen to experts, okay? And if a master's student is not an expert, what is room for them on that technical working group? So based on the discussion with Dr. Cage and what you know and all your interactions, what do you think the institutions can do to enhance the utility of their products? And do not say repositories, please.
Okay, I have not said it. Thank you so much. One thing which encourages me is the very high correlation between citation and publication. The reason why we use citation to measure use is because we could prove it. If a study is cited in this document and the arguments around the use are clear, I can share with you, Professor, and say, my study was used, symbolically or instrumentally to solve this. But mine was the only study for Professor Chan. I would say, I was the only one from the second to the other. After 10 years, I would brag about it because it is cited. But once it is not cited, then our methods need to change. Maybe go to bedside use and so on. Research. Another important point is, learning by doing. For me, is very important. Learning by doing, as I say, I brought my kids here. One of them will discover the cure for cancer by listening to this speech. They don't know what's going on, but they'll remember. Yeah, so learning by doing. So placing students there in the deep end would be like listening posts to see what happens. Okay, understand how the discussions are ongoing, and if their research products are there, they can be presented there. I have found in some of these pillars, students from School of Public Health presenting some of these COVID-19 pillars. I was surprised because my general assumption was, these guys don't synthesize anything. But I found students presenting, and I think that's an opportunity. So what is the take home? My take home is universities should make their research accessible, first of all. And accessibility includes, publication. So they should invest in that. The other way of making their research accessible is first of all making the end users aware of what's going on. What type of research is Makere using, creating? Using the MDGs, the research was a priority. When we use the health systems, the research was clustered around health services. Things to do with health financing, health, so on and so forth, which are relevant today, were not being used. So I think, again, as a university, reprioritize and re-engineer where we are focused. That would be my thinking if I were important.
Okay, I'll hand this over to the chair. Thank you very much.
Kachiwanuka, for bringing in a different angle to this discussion. And in the interest of time, we shall quickly move to Dr. Patrick Yakagawa. Welcome.
Thank you.
We didn't save the last for best, but we expect some also different angle to the discussion.
Thank you very much, the chair. It's a pity I can't face him, so I have to look at him at a certain angle, but hopefully be able to hear him. Thank you very much, Dr. Obuku. I hope you still have the calories, the energy, the ATP to carry on.
He has water.
He has water. And again, thank you very much for you inviting your family here. I hope you took them through what happens here. Say that they don't in any way think we don't like you. Have a very simple job of just engaging you towards the end. I'll build on what she said. She talked about on your conceptual framework. I would like to know why you chose to look at your work through using a conceptual framework and not a theoretical framework, because that will help me understand your work. I read the work, but looking at what you can call a conceptual framework, it's very close to a theoretical framework.
Oh, I didn't know that. I just read. So thank you so much, Dr. Yakagawa Patrick, for first of all examining me, but also asking that very relevant question, which of course is expected at this level. Now, I just, the fact that there are very many theoretical models around knowledge use, and it was very difficult to come about what to use to inform this thesis. The one that totally discouraged me is called the off theory, off standing for Oxman, Fritham, and Frotto, which introduced and concluded that you don't need a theory, okay, to investigate research use. And therefore, I looked around and said what relates to the clinical setting, and it was the knowledge action framework by Graham and others. But in terms of transfer, I needed to look into more policy-related work at country level, and it was informed by the Davis and Sawanga model. So I thought that at that level, I would put together concepts, a set of ideas on how I think the whole pathway flows. This leads to this. Of course, using the traditional, having come from a clinical trialist, I use the traditional epidemiological model: intervention, outcome, confounders. So the confounders would be the predictors down there, the outcome would be the application, and then the intervention would be, the knowledge generation, and all those things in between. Clearly, I'm not too sure why I didn't use a theoretical framework, which up to now, probably I don't know the difference. Arguing around the off theory of you don't need a theory. You need, according to the scholars, Oxman and others, evidence needs to be robust. Evidence needs to be unbiased, and evidence use does not need to be investigated using a theoretical framework. So I thought the concept is just enough.
Well, just for guidance, the paradigm that defines your study determines whether you're going to use a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework. And in your literature review, you did indicate that we have positivism and constructivism.
Yes.
And I think you had a mix of all.
Yes.
And that means that most likely you have a conceptual framework. But I think in your explanation, you sounded like you are using a theoretical framework. But that's something you can work on.
Yeah, I need to understand that. Thank you. I didn't know those.
To the specifics, Dr. Cage and yourself, you alluded that most developing countries, when you look at their health policies, they're quite shaped by global discourses. Do you agree? Most of the policies we have in the health sector, in general, in developing countries, they're quite shaped by international discourse or global discourses. Is that something you agree with?
In many ways, yes, because we subscribe as a member state to the WHO, for example.
Now, what would you tell the young people who want to influence our national policies? How can they navigate around that maze, being aware that our policies are shaped by global discourses where we have very limited influence? And you want young, like you said, you want these master students to have an influence. And you have already acknowledged that we have a scenario where most of the policies, at least the direction we take, are shaped by global discourses. What is it that they can do in order to have a meaningful contribution.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very important. Some of these are eye-opening, like that one. I hadn't thought about it that way, but offhand, and I'm not using the off theory, but offhand, I'm thinking that one, if you look at the globalization of evidence, which was a theme that emerged from our directive content analysis, we found that there were two pathways. There was the extent to which, although we contributed to policy at the international level, that guideline was exposed again to Uganda. So because we share global goals, we share a common pattern of diseases, we want to compare notes with other countries, so we globalize the consensus at that level. However, the contribution of master students, which is rarely documented, and this is what I believe from interacting with them, from looking at the School of Public Health, how they engage their students, at the district level, is to define the local contexts and provide for, implementation considerations. If I go and do the prevalence of malaria in Loro City, where I come from, okay, another student does in Masaka City, for instance, then that will help with the planning. Yes, it will not be cited, but it will help with the planning. So I think the students are doing a good job. It just needs to be documented and pushed out there. For them impacting international policy, as I say, these were probably bold efforts at the international level. People were looking for evidence, and fortunately they found, for example, the only other study was Dr. Chan's study. So I doubt that they will be able to push their work directly to international level, except to make it available through publications. As they are available through publications, through open access, then it can be picked up by decision makers anywhere in the world. For example, Dr. Njama's study on asymptomatic parasitemia was picked up in Canada, but I did not find any citation here in Uganda, although it could have been used.
Well, that takes me to the next question. I'm sure you've heard in the corridors at least the users, the people you're calling users, the policy users, the people who make decisions on what we are going to undertake or pursue, claiming that the research we do is not relevant. They don't have where to utilize it. And you're saying it is very possible that we can enhance the relevance of our research. And I think Makerere, at least in their guidelines for graduate training, they require you to do relevant research, addressing national priorities. What is it that we can do to enhance the relevance of our research, at least for the graduate students that you spoke to, that you studied, whose dissertations you studied?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, very, very important issue on prioritization. Yes, prioritization was an issue scoring less than the average at 2.75 or 2.12. Recently, as I was preparing for this thesis, I passed by the school of the CAES, and there was a narrow National Agricultural Research Organization and Agricultural School of Agriculture, I think, conference going on. And I was very impressed. I actually took a picture, but I was able to show it here for the slide. And I was impressed to see Makerere engaging the sister research organization, which is closer to the field. What I would have loved to see was Makerere engaging what used to be NARCS, of course now Operation Wealth Creation, because they are closer to the people. NARO and Makerere are, one and the same, the agricultural research organizations and guys. So I would like to see the students, and students were participating, they were entering here at the conference, engaging with the NARCS, those who are in the field, what do they see, what is needed, and other farmer groups. There is a Farmers Federation, I think. Those should be part and parcel of what's called embedded knowledge translation, where they are part of, engaging with students. I'm very sure in the field of technology, that becomes even more important in terms of technological transfer and innovations, where the innovators can have their innovations. I know one in Tinder there, and they have to engage industry. So then my final question was, at the end of the thesis, to what extent do we engage Uganda Manufacturers Association? It's something often, how do you go to Barbara Mulwana and look at her milk and say, I can improve the yield of your cows? What is that opportunity? Where will you find her? Is it important? And many of these people are made professors. Sudhir was made a professor. Okay, to what extent can he come about and give a talk around improving the hospitality industry? Because he's a leader there. Can he come and talk to the business students? Can he come and talk to the hospitality, the tourism students? All those cases and so. So I think the direct engagement, we are still lacking. As individuals from the push, we are trying to solve the problem, which can be solved by those in the pool, from the pool sector. users.
Well, you seem to be arguing for more university-industry relations. Is that right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And there's a school of thought that argues that research in universities that are very much aligned towards addressing societal problems should be defined by the questions that the industry needs to be addressed.
Yes.
What's your view on that as far as health is concerned?
Yes, as far as health is concerned, let me give you an example. In the health industry, if you like, or the enterprise, when COVID came, all of a sudden, there was a shortage of things like things we took for granted, ventilators. America has gone to the moon. They were unable to have enough ventilators, for example, and they have to go to GM Motors and reconfigure their factory to produce ventilators. And it brought about interest. Chambogo University, Mackay University, trying to make low-cost, effective, ventilators to support, the hunger of oxygen among patients who are, suffering from COVID-19. So the problem presents an opportunity, and immediately the university took it on. And I do not think the university is the same today. The questions having come from the industry, they could no longer export, they could no longer move. Now you go to Ginger, and there is a line and line of factories producing masks, something they didn't think about. Look at the sanitizers. Suraya was producing on behalf of the company in Japan, these sugarcane companies. But that is the opportunity of embedding some of these postgraduate students. They are looking at the business models, identifying the problems by immersing themselves in the system. I will tell you, many of these clinicians come about with the research questions by immersing themselves in the what, and dealing with the patients and identifying them. So it's very important that opportunity for the building continues, but now at a higher level of the industry. So that's my view. I agree with that assertion.
Okay, great. Much as we had very few, I hope you're not tired, we had very few indicators that the students' work was being utilized in the different policy processes. Are there specific areas of policy processes that you think most of the work was utilized? Was it in the conceptualization of the issue? Was it in the strategies? Was it in the actual actions that are delivered at the unit? Because that matters a lot on how important the work is that is being utilized. It's in shaping the national policies themselves or the frameworks. I would like to know what you think about that.
Thank you so much. Very important question along the so-called value chain, the value chain of research use. If you look around the literature, Easterbrookes, the lady called Easterbrookes and others in Canada, she's a nurse. We've done a lot of research around utilization at the bedside. And I defer to use that approach because if you look at the bedside practices in Uganda, for example, clinicians typically will use guidelines. And because of medical legal issues, will rarely challenge existing guidelines. So the opportunity to input in the knowledge translation process rests in the guidelines most of the time. Rarely will you find a clinician, except senior clinicians, professor level, may move away from the guidelines. So yes, the positioning of the graduate student will be at a different level. And I should say a precursor. So as you see, by far, using policy-related documents was instrumental, meaning the problem-solving model. We want to understand the problem between, intractable seizures among people who have malaria and which drug works. We need to solve that problem. Which drug works better? Which drug is cheaper? It doesn't have, was found to be working better. Intrarectal quinine versus IV quinine. Many times you come and find that yes, the injectable quinine is there, but the IV giving set is not there. So if you have one which can be administered rectally and solve the problem. So you see, it was a problem-solving model and used in, should I say, strategies. I should say strategies, policies. In terms of concepts, yes, Musime's study was used in defining the etiology, the cause, the most common cause of diarrhea, in low and middle income countries, and they found enteric, bacteria. Yet, so that could have been used in conceptualizing and defining the problem.
In your opinion, at what point do you consider to be the most important if it's going to be effective?
I think the most important for our set is in the what do they call it? Downstream. Downstream, where we need actionable messages. Because as a low and middle income country, we rarely have the opportunity to invest in the overthinking. We need to come up with tools which are based on evidence, and at the peripheral center setting there in Anyeke Health Center for there, where I come from, Loro City. That person is not going to start evaluating which systematic is better. They don't even internet for Christ's sake. So if we give them tools which are already synthesized based on evidence, when the child comes, fever is at 8.5, give Panadol, that kind of actionable message, what is important at the periphery.
Okay, in your discussion, you did allude, maybe before we get there, are you aware that we have two schools of thought as far as public policy processes are concerned? We have a school of thought that argues that public policy processes are very objective, they are rational, we use evidence, and the way you conceptualized your study, this is what I picked, that public policy processes are objective. As long as there is evidence, we're going to pick these ideas and surely we shall have them in these processes. That's one school of thought. But there's another one that says, look, public policy processes are actually political. It's about interests. The actors in there have interests and they will pursue these interests using all the available means in order to influence policy processes. And here we are, you are arguing that these students, these graduate students, should be able to influence policy processes. Okay? From your experience, now you are our expert. What do you think they need to do to work within this environment that we quite often assume that it's a very objective one that relies on evidence? In reality, we know that policy processes are very political.
Yes, thank you very much again, Dr. Kaba, for that question. As we said earlier, knowledge translation is a complex process. It's iterative, and contexts are necessarily different, and those contexts are affected by relationships. They are affected by power play, and so on. I'd like to argue around the 3 I's framework by, of course, Revis and colleagues who talked about the first I being ideas play a role in the policy process. The second one is interests. Who is going to lose, who is going to gain, when this policy is passed. And the third one, of course, is institutions. What institutions are going to pervade this research till the decisions are made. In priority setting, the one which applies most is John Kingdom's agenda setting model, where we have the problem. Problems are defined even by the ground nutshell on the street. Okay. Then the policies are made by all of us, the scholars and the actors in the policy room. What is an antithesis to this whole process is working the politics. So working the politics is what moves the other two. And of course, actors in some way must marry the three so that the streams flow and open the policy window for decision making. A very good example, of course, is sometimes natural disaster, which can influence the decisions. We are all locked up here and we have nothing to do but rely on scientists to give us the way forward. I'm not sure that's the case now that the place is open. So yes, I am persuaded by both realms that depending on the context, research may lead. I can tell you it was impressive. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, to see for the first time the president sitting down and also leading from behind, holding they have said this, let's lock down. For me, it was the epitome of classical decision-making instrumental. But symbolically, it's the case. Let's make a decision anti-homosexuality up, bring the evidence.
Well, I think what, if I were in a position, I would say it's about identifying where you can get some form of power. And power here is, power can come from many sources. For academics, usually the evidence you provide. The men and women you're referring to, probably the president was listening to them because they had some form of power in terms of knowledge, yes, which could not be contested. So what that implies is that maybe the rigor that your graduate students put in their work will give them some form of power, for all the actors to believe in them. So I encourage you to look at the different sources of power in defining or shaping public policy processes, especially in the health sector. Moving towards the end, I can see the chair is looking at me with an eye of when are you finishing?
Not really.
The last part of my questions are going to be more specific now on your work. You did choose certain proxy indicators, publication and citation, right? And you did acknowledge that citations are imperfect. I'm using your words.
Yes.
You actually said citation was an imperfect proxy. And which is very good because you're very open. You criticized yourself. How did you handle it? Using a very imperfect proxy indicator. How did you navigate around it to make sure that whatever findings we have from your work, we should take them in good faith, much as there are those drawbacks?
So, thank you very much again, Dr. Kaba. So, whereas a publication was an imperfect proxy, I was encouraged by the movement of Professor Douglas Altman and other statisticians who argued around absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, to the extent that what we found was the tip of the iceberg, that in fact, this postgraduate research can be used. For it, that was the interest. But can it be used, by the way? Because the general notion is, man, they don't have the interest to publish what, as you call, is rigorous enough to be used. And the perception is that because they don't have the interest, maybe it's in poor quality. And that, contributes them to great interest. So, my thinking around that question, therefore, is that postgraduate students generally are less motivated to publish. And if you find citation, even in scholarly work, that is something. But if you find it in policy-related work, that is a plus. So in many ways, this work really contributed to decision making and was surprisingly, helpful even at the highest level. Now, citation grossly underestimated use, as Professor mentioned. There are many ways of research use. There are many aspects of many pathways research can take. And if it was used in Uganda, it was simply a selection bias where it wasn't documented. And I believe in many ways it was used but not documented. To date, I'm always arguing with my colleagues at the MOH, why can't we cite? But citations can make half the document. If you look at some of these WHO guidelines, 100 pages and a quarter of it is just citation. So who's going to print that?
Well, when you have a proxy indicator that you are wary of, it's always fair that the kind of conclusions you make reflect some of the weaknesses you have identified. Unfortunately, in your work, you are very confident. You don't feel, when one reads your piece of work, you are not, for lack of a right word, humble enough to reflect the limitations of these indicators and also the expectations. So you ought to also look at the kind of models that you developed to make sure that any reader will be able to appreciate that the proxy indicators we had or you had limitations. But nonetheless, the models still can be useful. The beauty with science is that all results can be useful, as it depends on how you present them. You did also have certain variables, both fixed and the random variables in that paper where you were looking at productivity. How did you make a decision to decide that this particular variable is going to be fixed and the other one is going to be random?
Yes, systematic review.
Yeah.
Yes. So generally in systematic reviews, the idea is that you want to make a summary statement, isn't it? In the theory, using the same central limit theory, general general, the sample size is high, then you're moving towards normal distribution. That is the idea. And of course, using probability to determine effects. You know, what is the probability that work would be published, and the average was 0.23 using the random effects meta-analysis, which is liberal. So the hypothesis around random effects meta-analysis is that the estimate of effects is randomly distributed across the different studies in a normal distribution. Whereas in the fixed effects model, you have only one true estimate of effect, and the study by Osgen therefore influenced, contributed too much weight, 90%, and therefore, if you see the Osgen, it had a 6% probability, and you know, for the fixed effects meta-analysis, had a 7%, meaning this is really a function of the big Turkish. So what was the choice of what influenced the choice of using both models? One, there was a high heterogeneity. The I-squared, Higgins I-squared, was, I think, even 98%. And therefore, the fixed effects meta-analysis lacked, you know, you had to interpret it to the portion, and therefore encouraged further analysis to do a random effect, which is more liberal, and you can see it now relaxed from 7%, it's a more conservative 7% to 23%. And in the interpretation, we are going up to 29%, the upper bound 25% confidence interval for random effects meta-analysis, and the lower bound confidence interval, lower bound confidence level for the fixed effects meta-analysis. So the choice was influenced by the heterogeneity. The studies were too different, and the studies were not large. The number was not large. If I had 25 studies, maybe the fixed effects would have worked.
Great. Now, just building on that, systematic reviews, they get arguably the same praise and also the same way. Some people are bored. They think they are not the way to go because of a couple of drawbacks. Are there specific observations that you made in terms of weaknesses of taking systematic reviews and what others can learn from you, but also how you managed to minimize those weaknesses or those drawbacks?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Kaba. Again, doing systematic reviews of observational studies. Yeah, inherent biases which are carried from the primary studies. For instance, bulk, if not all, were cross-sectional studies. So things to do with selection bias were carried into the systematic review. And I think this could explain the very high variability. And that is the heterogeneity of 98% using Higgins I-squared. And of course, Cochrane's p-value was very significant, 0.001 and so on. So that was the disadvantage of doing the quantitative time meta-analysis in this case for a prevalence. But there was no other way of estimating the average. Otherwise, we'll be talking about different figures here and there. The second disadvantage is that there were interventions which were talked about in qualitative studies. For instance, if you look at the study by Bolen and others in the New Zealand School of Public Health, which showed that students talked about things like the duration from submitting an article publication just discouraged them to move further. And then responses of the reviewer, and some of them lacked protected time. These are qualitative, very important findings which couldn't be quantified, which were missed by the systematic review. But I'll tell you a secret. At the time I was developing the protocol, we were trying to do what's called mixed method systematic review. And the field had not yet advanced. We actually failed to find reviewers. So I had to go back to the quantitative, and within 6 months, the paper was published. And you know, those are some of the considerations and what you can pursue. I was trying to be innovative and discover something.
But we know that because meta-analysis loses out, you miss out of the quantitative
aspects, yes.
aspects. And that's why we do systematic reviews. I would have expected you to also bring out like what you just mentioned. From a systematic, you avoid doing the analysis that is going to give you the quantitative data because of the weaknesses in the papers that you have, but you are able to bring out the information from the systematic review, which is useful. Yeah. I hope you will consider that in your revisions. Then finally, I'm about to finish. You did use the self-assessment tool for research institutions. Yeah, and in your presentation, you did mention that you made some modifications. Is that right?
Yes.
What were those modifications and what informed the modifications you made.
Just going to come, I'm downloading.
Why I'm asking this, you're encouraging universities to actually use it. Well, one would be tempted to think that you're a proponent of the model, and therefore you have very justifiable reasons as to why this model should be adopted. But you also made some modifications, meaning whoever will be using it, most likely, especially in this part of the world, may want to use the modified model. That's why I'm asking this question.
Yes, thank you so much. So the Satori was developed by the Tehran University of Medical Sciences to be used in various ways. One, it was to be used by faculty to self-assess. So this time we wanted to apply it to students to self-assess. Second, it is to be used using a consensus approach. Okay, meaning you don't sit down as head of department, you call your, your different leaders, sit down and do honest self-check. That is the second adjustment that we did. The third adjustment was to reduce the number of questions, because we had interest, in making sure the questionnaire is completed. So we removed some irrelevant questions which we thought, from the perspective of the student, they were not able to answer things to do with the funding in the department. That is information they didn't have. And we removed. So we reduced it from 50 to 34. Although we didn't explicitly estimate, for example, the inter-rater agreement or the Cronbach's alpha, we did a quick and clean comparison of two similar variables. And we found an agreement, a crude agreement of 0.82. And we thought that was enough. We didn't publish it because we did do it like the Cronbach's alpha using this data. We just used two variables with a simple calculator for an agreement of 0.82 in the response, and it was post hoc. Okay. So those were the three modifications: the context of application, how it is applied, and the number of questions were reduced from 50 to 34 to make it user-friendly, because it's self-assessment. Give me 50 questions, 34 questions, completeness, and we found actually challenges of completeness. There was a question where the response, there was a non-response bias, n being 185 up to 139, and we recognize it in the limitations, cross-sectional self-assessment questionnaire.
Well, in your thesis, that description on how, rather that procedure on how you worked around the modifications is not that elaborate. I think moving forward, you may have to describe it. Then lastly, Chair, this is a common question for all PhD defenses. I'm sure you prepared for it.
Let me take one.
At the end of this, maybe close to 3 hours engagement, and all the many years that you have been working on this, have this classical question, at least where I come from, because a PhD is a doctor of philosophy. You are moving towards becoming a philosopher. And what philosophers do. They theorize, they bring new understanding, okay? New ways of understanding phenomena. That's what we expect philosophers to do, and that's the direction you have chosen to take by undertaking the PhD process. So in one sentence, what's the thesis? What's your thesis? What is it that you want us to go back with? And we say, look, OBUKU, Anthony, EKWARO, I don't know the arrangement of your names. This is the thesis. So wherever you go, we shall be associating that particular viewpoint to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Very important philosophical question. I think, and thank you for it. I think the issue is that I want to use the word West, but West. I
agree with her, by the way. I did make a comment there that that was a very strong word.
So there's a lot of research done out there for postgraduate students, and it's found useful. And universities therefore should invest in improving its quality and then making it more accessible.
That's your thesis.
That is my thesis.
Maybe just to.
Because I want my mother to go back to that. If I start to values.
No, I think when you are drafting or crafting your thesis, it can't just be a wish list, because that's a wish list. You have to look at how you conceptualize your study. That's why I asked you, do you have a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework? And you said it was a conceptual framework, which is true, because you had a couple of models, which concepts that you're calling models, that informed how you conducted your study. And then you even had hypotheses that you called assumptions. Okay, those are going to shape or to define your view generated from the data that you have been able to get. So I think in that chapter where you did your synthesis,
yes,
that is missing. That's why I asked that philosophical question at the end, that as you look at that chapter of synthesis, you reflect on how you conceptualized the study, the hypothesis that you had, and which kind of conclusions you're able to get. And that will inform your thesis. Then you can associate that particular thesis to you. Thank you. Chair, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Obuku for continuing to respond to the questions. Yeah, so colleagues, I know our time is fast spent, but we, as a public defense, we are expected to get questions from the public. The public is just reminded that their questions should be short to the point, and they are not meant to add to the marks or subtract. So I saw hands going up well before we reached this time. And I think we have a lot of hands online, and I know there are some in here. We may not take all the hands, but I'll try to be fair, but will also depend on how people are asking. So Dr. Godfrey Bosa, your hand went up first. Are you there?
I'm there.
Please go ahead and ask your question. Concise.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Book, and thank you, Chair. Quickly, my question is, in the systematic review, gray literature accessibility is a challenge. How did you go about this, and could this affect the generalization of your conclusion? I submit.
Dr. Buku, please respond.
Yes, one way we went about gray literature was to do what we call code search. We searched PubMed and ERIC, and we also searched corroborated search in this spot. So gray literature is found through searching widely. That's what we did, comprehensive search.
Okay, thank you. If you have a hand up here, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll continue with the online. Dr. Arthur Bagonza.
Thank you very much, Chair and Dr. Obuku. This was a very fantastic defense, but I just have one question. From your research, is it that the students do not want to publish, or is it that the journals have a bias towards studies coming from Africa? And therefore, would you want to recommend that we as Africans, it's time to rise up, have our own journals that will accept our students' research? Because most of these journals have a bit of bias. And did you see any bias in the publications? And lastly, what is the percentage of that waste? Did you bother to find out how many articles are started on Research Square? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bagonza. Nice seeing you here. The proportion of the waste was 80%. You know, this
waste. Quote unquote.
Missed opportunity, not waste.
Dr. Bagonza, you have to respond. Raise the temperature here. So sorry, it was not waste. 82% of what was not yet used. is 82%, and the estimate came to about 900 and something US dollars, direct translation of about $1,000 per thesis of 3 million shilling. And that came to about, and that's the opportunity cost of what we have invested but not recouped. I think you can see how the topic has improved. Now, there's equally bias, publication bias, I think starting all the way from the student, not only the journal. And I think the drive is from the student. You can, the discussion around the room talked about, so what is the purpose of doing the thesis? Gain a skill and, move on to the next job. But yes, there is a journal of negative studies. I don't know how well they take research that has not shown effects. I think for as long as the research is rigorous, something that came from Dr. Yakagaba, as long as there is rigor, then we trust the findings. We trust the findings, whether they are positive or what we need to expect. We have the African Health Sciences Journal and many other journals. What I know is that the challenge is reviewers. Reviewers, for instance, I know I receive a bag every week. As soon as I finish a systematic review, when I think I'm going to rest, Professor Tumine will say another one. Because, we are just not too many who are willing to review journal articles. I've reviewed over 80, and I'm happy to do more. So we as scientists also have a role to play in ensuring that this work will reduce publication bias due to difficulties in publication. I know for sure there are students who must have submitted at the moment their paper was rejected. Man, they're waiting. What's your problem? I have no publication. I'm a consultant in WHO. I'm not going to the university. Why should I publish? So that's why those sentiments are also there contributing publication bias. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we have some questions inside the room? Hey, the room is intimidated by the candidate.
We are happy.
About the questions. Yes, Dr. Ronald Kaiwa.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have a few questions. Thanks, Dr. Buku, for this.
One question. Please ask one question. We are not doing well with time.
Yes, I just wanted to understand, because every PhD, every study is going, okay, the study is going to be awarded a PhD, but I was just confused. A PhD in medicine, a PhD in education, because when I read the title, I actually... So which discipline is Dr. Obuku in, and his PhD, is it in medicine? Is it so? Then another thing, like what Dr. Byakagaba asked, I just wanted to just take away the PhD from this work. What new knowledge are we taking from this work? Just in one statement. Thank you.
Please respond. He has asked two questions, but probably it's fair you always respond to the second one.
Yes, the first one is, I think it's, in policy studies, we say you don't want to look at policy because you don't eat sausages. If you look at how sausages are made, you won't eat them, and this is the issue with policy. So I think it's a PhD, and I don't know what it is, but I think it's a PhD.
If all goes well, we shall give you a PhD.
Yeah, if all goes well. But what I'm studying is for PhD. Yeah. Now, what new knowledge do you take out of here? The new knowledge, and very, very importantly, is to first of all frame the problem. The problem was not framed very well. We all had assumptions out there. Postgraduate students, by the way, their work. So flow quality, does it even make it to policy? So that question we have answered. That actually, if you do your work very well as a postgraduate student, you can actually change decisions, you can impact decisions. And we documented use objectively and quantitatively. We also managed to demonstrate how research may be used. And for the first time, showed the issues that may be around, publication, and how they may affect the output. So yes, many times, there is a notion that a PhD must discover a product. Sometimes the kind of PhDs that we do is that there is knowledge out there, and you want to tap it and reorganize it. And that to me is very, very important in new knowledge especially synthesizing what's out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Obuku. I see Frederick Oporia.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Obuku. You projected a slide that was talking. Yes, I have one question. So, Dr. Obuku, you projected a slide that said emerging themes of how research was used. And I was wondering, where were these themes emerging from? Because with qualitative studies, themes do not emerge. You generate them. Otherwise, you put the data there and wait for the themes to emerge themselves. So did they emerge or you generated?
Thank you very much, Oporia. What we did was a multiple case study, and according to him, a multiple case study, one of the characteristics is what we call a thick description. So we had to go and do what we call use policy sciences approaches, documentary analysis, look at a policy document. For example, the one of the British HIV/AIDS Beaver guidelines on HIV, how they used the Dr. Kambugu's study, to justify the decision which they had already taken. That entails analysis of the text, and therefore we had to use a couple of approaches of what we call content analysis. The first approach we used was directed content analysis, and this direct content analysis simply means you have a framework or a model or a theory that influences how you analyze the text and the themes which are predetermined. And that was the Carol Weiss model, conceptual use, symbolic use, and then of course instrumental. Now the second approach was the so-called conventional content analysis, where you look at the content and then you begin to code what is coming out from 2, 3, 4, 5 different cases. And this is how we came about with things like globalization of evidence. It became clear early on that, that this research, by the way, most of these citations, we are rarely finding citations, for example, in Uganda. And in some cases, we find these citations go up to, guidelines in Canada, immigration of refugees, which is not applicable to Uganda. That guideline is not applicable to Uganda. So we managed to delineate these pathways, and that's how the themes emerged. You have to think about it with a PhD.
Thank you for responding, and I'm afraid in the interest of time, we can't take all the questions. But Dr. Obuku is available, whether he becomes a PhD today or not, to respond to all issues we want to know about his work. Allow us to conclude the audience discussion. And the next 10 minutes is a short break. We are going to meet as examination panel in the Dean's office to deliberate on the proceedings. This is like the Kenyan election, by the way, it can win. Can be a no or yes. And so let's go meet quickly, come back and give you a verdict. So please don't go away. I see there's still some tea, and those online, you can just have your short break. The next 10 minutes, we shall be back. So enjoy your short break. And Dr. Obuku, eat something to be able to receive a verdict.
I can just start my online audience because some of you may not come. They just started to come. Some of you are going away, even if the budget is not out.
Eddie, are we on? We are on, eh? So welcome back from the short break. The committee has met and made deliberations. We've come up with a verdict. And I will ask the person who is not in the room to give us that verdict, because he can easily run away. Dr. Akechi, are you on?
Yes, I'm on, Chair.
Can you kindly give the verdict of the examination panel?
Thank you, Chair. Congratulations, Dr. Oboku. You have passed your thesis, and you are now Dr. Oboku. You have only minor corrections that will be checked by Dr. Suzanne Chiwanuka. Congratulations, and we look forward to you moving this work forward and progressing into other research areas. Congratulations. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Congratulations, Dr. Obuku. You're now Doctor here. Not sure whether that should be the case. You remain a doctor.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, but congratulations. And we have a few more minutes. We wanted to first give an opportunity to Professor Sewan Kambo to say a few words. And then we shall ask Obuku to also speak. Obuku, speak in 1 minute. And then we can declare this defense closed. Professor Sewan Kambo, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. Yes, I'm on. My voice, as I said in the morning, is affected by a terrible flu. But congratulations, Dr. Buku, for getting this far and satisfying the panel that your work and presentation is worth a PhD, even though you may make some revisions to your thesis. I also want to extend great thank you to my co-supervisor, John Levis in Canada, and all those in the room and outside the room who have supported Dr. Buku to get to this stage. Last comment is that the attendance was impressive. Online, there were 300 people logged on, and up to the last minute, it was 295. And when you add those in the room, that's well over 300. If I may use another half a minute, I think the method of sending out information and getting it known that there is this PhD defense, we need to analyze it this time so that in the future we can do it the same way and the information reaching to as many people as possible. Thank you very much, Chair, and back to you.
Thank you very much. The issue of how to disseminate the adverts is noted, but we've also seen that sometimes it depends on the candidates. Some candidates don't want to advertise, so they hamper our efforts. Others are much more supportive in us disseminating widely. So, but it's well noted. So this is the moment for Dr. Obuku to give his acceptance speech.
Thank you so much, professors, the panelists, and most of all those who attended this defense. I was very many times floored by the examiners, but I realized that the people who said congratulations could not realize that when I was over talking, I was actually being floored. I was trying to come around the answer, but very, very important insights coming from Dr. Chiwanuka and Dr. Yakagawa, but also, you know, practical perspective from Dr. I'm very grateful for your contribution to improving this thinking. Actually, the past 2 weeks, I think if I qualify to be a PhD, it's in the past 2 weeks. That's what I can say, because I discovered things in my thesis, I discovered gaps. Before I conclude, of course, I have already done my acknowledgements, my family, and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank greatly the blockbuster Professor Sewankambu. I keep telling him that, you know, Professor, my name is, I'm going to change my name to Obuku bin Sewankambu because of his tremendous contribution to my career. You know, we just met, and you know, I went to his office. I said, you know, I've been applying for PhDs in clinical trials, but you know, I don't get them. And I said, you know, but if I hang around you, now conceptual use of opportunity. If I hang around you, I'll get something. I'm doing moved all the way, establishing the African. And that's why I say mentorship is important. He's taken me to say the book. You know, they have asked me to find an upcoming researcher. I had around 2 publications, but he took me there to South Africa and introduced me, and that motivated me to work hard. And one time, you know, he said, "I'm not able to go. Can you go and represent yourself?" Can give students. Finally, my message to decision makers, the decision makers in this case, someone was asked, is the PhD in education? I think in many ways, you are the decision makers here. I would encourage that, and we've started the movement. We are still trying to persuade more people that evidence synthesis becomes part and parcel of at least PhD research, and to go it down to decision making. Thank you very much for giving me the time and for supporting me to be examined. You know how at times, you know, there can be shortcomings, but I'm happy that this decade of research, actually, I told my supervisor in Canada that, you know, this is a decade of research. The idea came about in 2012, registration 2015, defense 2022. My daughter there used to say, but Daddy, when are you finishing? I started when I was in B2. I'm now in S whatever. Yes. And finally, of course, Professor Levis, because this is academic, Professor Levis, John, who took us to Canada, and my colleague, you know, took us there to learn further methods. And the most important learning I did was political science. You know, it's political science, frameworks and all these theories Patrick was quizzing me about. I just forgot them because it was during me. Thank you so much. God bless you. And please, my graduation party, I have never done one, but when I graduate, I will take myself back 20 years ago and invite those whom I see in the list here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I forgot.
You man,
My mom is over there. Mother is over there. She came all the way from Lower City. Mommy, thank you for coming. Very inspiring. My children are there, and my wife, Marianne, is there. Thank you so much for coming. You know, this is I made a PhD the family issues. You're also concerned. When are you
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's a good note to end on, to thank the family for supporting Dr. Obuku. I know some of the family members like Andrew, but also to thank very much the examination panel. By the way, they do a lot of work behind the scenes, reading these huge books. You don't see them, but they are huge, and they read them 3-4 times so that they are ready to take on the student. And this is nothing, they are not paid for it really. So thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Byakagawa and Dr. Suzanne Chiwanuka. And also thank you very much, Dr. Samuel Akech. If there is no opponent, again, we can't have a defense. And he reads the book later after these first ones. So it's also time, and he usually has not much time. And he has really made us enjoy that defense. Sometimes the defense can be very brutal and everyone leaves worried about the verdict. But he was really warm and made it a very enjoyable process. Thank you very much. I really thank the supervisors. Thank you, the audience online and here. Please come again when we invite you. You have seen how it is really a nice experience. And this is how you also get, I think this is also still how people can get ideas to do research. And when they see OBUKU, they are like, I want to be like that in future. So thank you. And I would like to declare this defense closed. Thank you. Just about to start on severe malaria in the Davis Lecture Theatre, which we are jointly holding with the Ministry of Health. Malaria is back with a big bang, so please come and hear what is happening. Actually, more of people have lost immunity because of this too much. Because they are young.